A heating engineer died in a river and woke up in a desert where the sun shines with ultraviolet rays. He has no water, no shade. 2 hours until he passes out. 4 until death. He presses his palm against the scorching sand and thinks not in words but in diagrams, and the sand beneath his hand turns white with frost. Daniel Park opens his eyes and the first breath burns his throat. The air is dry and hot like the exhaust from an industrial dryer. His palms press into the sand and his skin sizzles. He jerks upright and rolls onto his back. An office shirt with rolled up sleeves, pants, boots. He's lying in the desert in his work clothes. The last thing he remembers is cold water and a river and a seatbelt and lungs full of water. And now the heat is melting the air above the horizon. He sits down and immediately regrets it. His head explodes with pain. He squints at the sun and immediately sees the catch. Too bright, too white. The spectrum is shifted toward ultraviolet. 6 years of working with thermal radiation have taught him to read light like an engineer. This is not the Earth's sun. To the left, scorched red cliffs rise toward the horizon. To the right, a flat plain of cracked clay, not a blade of grass, not a cloud. And in the sky, 2 silhouettes with leathery wings circle, soaring on thermal currents like gliders. Only gliders don't flap their wings. Daniel looks at them and utters a single expletive. Then a second. Then he closes his eyes and forces himself to think. The air feels no cooler than 50 degrees. Humidity is near 0. Under these conditions, a person without water loses consciousness in 2 hours and dies in 4. There is no water. There is no shade. There is a shirt, boots, and a head splitting so badly that thoughts come in words. And then he feels it, between his shoulder blades. As if someone had placed a piece of ice the size of a fist. A cold knot. Solid. Alive. It pulses in time with his heart. Daniel freezes. It's not an illness or a hallucination. The knot is real and radiates cold into his spine. He slowly brings his palm toward the sand. He doesn't touch it. He holds it 2 centimeters away, and he thinks not in words but in a diagram. Heat flows from point A to point B. The sand is point A. His palm is the conductor. His back is the radiator. The knot between his shoulder blades sways. His palm grows hot, and the sand beneath it is covered with a white crust of frost. Daniel pulls his hand away. The frost melts in 3 seconds, but it was there, white, on the rocky sand. The joint released the absorbed cold through the body to the outside, like a compressor, like a heat pump. It drew heat from the sand and expelled it through his back. Daniel Park, heating engineer, refrigeration system designer. He had just done with his bare hands what an industrial chiller does for $200,000. He lets out a short, hoarse laugh. Then he stops because the laughter dries out his throat. Then he stands up. He's unsteady on his feet. His boots sink into the sand, but he stands. And he knows 2 things. First, he's not on Earth. Second, he has a tool. Now he needs water, or people, or at least some shade. The cliffs are to the left. It's about 3 kilometers to them. In this inferno, that's an hour's walk, and half the time he has left. Daniel pulls his shirt tight and wraps it around his head. The t-shirt underneath is soaked with sweat. It'll dry in 10 minutes. He walks. Every step sinks into the hot sand. Heat radiates from the ground in waves. He counts his steps. On the 100th, he tries again. He puts his hand to his forehead. He thinks in a circuit. Heat from his head through his palm into the knot, through his back, out. His forehead cools for 3 seconds. Then the knot swings back and burns his back. Too fast. Too much heat at once. His body can't handle it. He needs an external radiator. But all around him is only sand and air hotter than his body. Nowhere to release it. He keeps going. On the 200th step, his lips crack until they bleed. On the 300th, his legs give out. On the 400th, the rocks are closer, but not much. The engineer doesn't panic. The engineer gathers data. The data is crap. His pulse is under 120. His skin is dry. He's run out of sweat. His body has gone into survival mode. Next comes confusion, then fainting, then death. Daniel picks up the pace. At the 600th step, he sees a crack in the rock, a shadow, a narrow strip a meter wide. He falls into it as if into a pool. He presses his back against the stone. The stone is hot, but in the shade, it's 15 degrees cooler, around 40 degrees. Still deadly, but it's not death in the next hour. He closes his eyes and allows himself a moment of weakness. He breathes. Then he thinks. He needs water. The humidity here is 5%. At 55 degrees, that's 4 grams of water per cubic meter. Not much, but not zero. There is water in the air. The question is how to get it. The dew point is somewhere around -10. Cool the surface to -10 and the water will condense. -10. In the desert, where the air is like an oven. Daniel presses both palms against the rock. He closes his eyes. He thinks not in spurts but smoothly, like a compressor running at low speed. Heat from the rock into his palms, from his palms into a knot, from the knot through his back into the air. Slowly. His back is warming up, but it's bearable. The stone cools down degree by degree. 50, 40, 35. He keeps the rhythm. His back is burning. Sweat is flowing between his shoulder blades from somewhere in his dehydrated body. Apparently, the knot is pushing its load. 30, 20. A film of moisture appears on the stone. Not condensation yet. Just that the stone is colder than the air and the moisture is drawn to it. Daniel holds on. 15, 10, 5, 0, -5. His back is burning with fire. He clenches his teeth. -8, 10 below. Droplets are forming on the rock. Small, transparent. There aren't many, but they're there. Daniel leans down and licks them off the rock. It tastes of dust and minerals, but it's water. Real water. He made water out of the desert air with his bare hands. His back burns so badly that he groans and collapses onto his side. The knot between his shoulder blades throbs hot and angry. Overload. He took in too much heat too quickly. The skin on his back is red as if burned. He lies in the crevice, breathing heavily. But he's smiling. Because now he knows. He can make cold. He can make water. He needs tools, materials, and time. But the principle works. He rests for 20 minutes. Then he gets up and trudges along the cliff in a narrow strip of shade. He conserves his strength. An hour later, he spots a trail. A well-trodden path in the sand between the rocks. People walk here. The trail leads south. Daniel follows it. Another hour later, a wall looms ahead. Not very tall, made of clay blocks. Behind it, roofs jut out, and a thin wisp of smoke creeps into the still air. The gate is open. Standing at the gate is a thin man in a cloak of wet fabric that is drying right on him. Dark skin, deep wrinkles. He blurts out something in a foreign language with sharp, short sounds. Daniel raises his hands, palms up. I'm unarmed. The man speaks some more. Daniel shakes his head, points to his throat, to his mouth, mimes drinking. The man stares for a long time. Then he yells at someone behind the wall. A sturdy, broad-shouldered woman with her hair under a scarf comes out from behind the building. She looks at the shirt on his head. Boots. A sun-scorched face. She throws a few words at the man. He shrugs. The woman approaches and holds out a clay mug. The mug contains murky, warm water, no more than 100 milliliters. Daniel takes the mug with both hands and drinks in small sips. The engineer knows that water on a dehydrated body is a blow to the kidneys. The woman watches. Then she nods and waves her hand. Come in. This is Tel Karam, a border village on the edge of a scorched plain. 12 buildings, 60 residents, one well that yields 2 buckets a day. 2 buckets for 60 people. He'll learn the numbers in 2 days, once he's memorized the first 30 words of the local language. For now, he stands in the doorway of the mud brick house, catching the coolness of the shade on his shoulders. And the cold knot between his shoulder blades pulses quietly and steadily, like a second heart. Daniel spent 2 days on the floor in the back room of the tavern. Yuna. That was the name of the woman who gave him water at the gate. He learned her name first. She repeated it 3 times, poking herself in the chest. Yuna. Then she poked him. He said his. She tried to pronounce it, and it came out as something like Danir. He nodded. That'll do. The tavern was a low building made of clay blocks with a ceiling of poles and stretched fabric over a layer of dry clay. Inside it was 45 degrees. Outside, 55. The 10-degree difference felt like a transition from hell to purgatory. Yuna gave him water 3 times a day, a small mug each time. Every time she grimaced as she measured it out. Daniel understood why on the second day. He saw her weighing the water on a homemade scale with stone counterweights. Every mug counted. Every sip cost money. He lay on a mat and studied the language. He pointed at an object. Yuna said the word. He repeated it. Water, fire, stone, food, hot, cold. At the word cold, Yuna smiled, briefly and bitterly, as if he had said something funny and sad at the same time. By the evening of the second day, Daniel knew about 40 words. By the morning of the third day, about 70. The language was strange. Similar to Arabic at its core, but with bits of something Korean or Japanese mixed in. As if several cultures had blended long ago and forged something of their own. The grammar was simpler than in any Earth language. Almost no declensions. The word order was fixed. Daniel suspected that the language had been simplified after the catastrophe. People no longer had time for complex constructions. On the third morning, Yuna woke him up before dawn. He got up. She said it briefly and without any room for argument. Daniel got up. She led him to the kitchen. The kitchen was a separate outbuilding with a clay oven and a stone shelf where food was stored. Yuna pointed to the shelf. 5 pieces of goat meat lay on it. The meat was gray around the edges. It stank. Not badly, but in a few more hours it would be inedible. Yuna said a caravan would arrive in a day. She had bought the meat 2 days ago. She paid with water, 1/4 of a bucket for 5 pieces. If the meat went bad, she'd lose 1/4 of a bucket. 1/4 of a bucket is 3 days' worth of drinking water for one person. She explained this slowly and simply. She chose words he already knew. Daniel listened and nodded. Then he asked in broken local dialect. There's a clay jug. There's a wet rag. There's a porous stone. There's a copper bowl. Yuna raised an eyebrow. Then she brought everything he asked for. The jug held about 3 liters, rough, with thick walls. The rag was a piece of an old cloak. The porous stone was found in a pile of construction debris behind the tavern. Pumice. Volcanic pumice. Light and full of air bubbles. An excellent insulator. The copper bowl was dented but intact. Daniel sat down on the kitchen floor. Yuna stood over him with her arms crossed. She watched. Daniel put the meat in the jug. He wrapped the jug in a wet rag. He placed it in the copper bowl with the remaining water. He covered it with the porous stone. Then he placed his palm on the side of the jug and began to work, slowly, like in the desert by a rock. But now he knew the rhythm. He knew the limit. The knot between his shoulder blades swayed and began to draw heat. From the jug, through the clay, through his palm, into his body. His body released the heat through his back into the kitchen air. The kitchen was already hot. The extra degrees dissolved unnoticed. Daniel calculated in his head. The mass of the meat was about 2 kilograms. The heat capacity of meat is close to that of water, 3.5 kilojoules per kilogram per degree. He needed to lower the temperature from 35 to -2, a 37-degree difference. 2 multiplied by 3.5 multiplied by 37, about 260 kilojoules, plus the heat capacity of the jug itself, plus losses, let's say 400 kilojoules. He was drawing heat at a rate of about half a kilowatt. No surges, a steady flow. His back was warming up but not burning. The wet rag on the jug helped. Evaporation carried away some of the heat on its own. After 5 minutes, the jug's walls felt cool to the touch. After 8, cold. After 10, condensation appeared on the clay. After 12, Daniel removed his hand and opened the lid. The meat lay on a thin layer of frost. The temperature inside felt like about -2, maybe -3. He turned to you. She wasn't moving. She stood as still as a statue. She was looking at the frost inside the jug, at the meat covered in a white crust. Then she slowly sat down on the floor. She didn't fall. She actually sat down. Carefully. As if her legs had given out, but she didn't want to show it. Daniel told her that the meat would stay fresh for another 3 days if they didn't open the lid. The porous stone on top acts as a stopper and an insulator. The wet rag on the outside provides additional cooling through evaporation. He needs to refresh the cold once a day. 10 minutes of work. Yuna was silent. Then she looked up at him. There was something in her gaze that Daniel didn't immediately recognize. Not gratitude, not surprise. Fear. She was afraid. Not of him. She was afraid of what it meant. A man who makes cold in a world where cold died out 7 years ago. This isn't a trick. It's a revolution. Daniel realized she was thinking faster than he was. He saw a picture of meat. She saw the end of an entire era. Then the fear faded. Yuna stood up. She brushed off her apron and said she had a business proposal for him. She'd give him a room, 2 meals a day, 3 mugs of water a day. He would work for her. He would cool whatever she told him to, not a word to anyone. If anyone found out, they would kill him for his ability before he could even say stop. Daniel nodded. He was an engineer, not a fool. In a world where a liter of water costs as much as a horse, a man who makes cold isn't a miracle. He's a target. The next few days he worked. Yuna found orders. The butcher from the next street brought 3 mutton legs. Yuna said an acquaintance had found a way to preserve meat longer. Secret. The butcher paid with 2 jugs of water. The herbalist came with a sack of dried leaves that were losing their properties in the heat. Yuna said it was cooler in her cellar. Secret. The herbalist paid with a jug of water and a handful of pain-relieving roots. Daniel worked at night when the heat subsided, and it was easier to cool off. Yuna counted the earnings. In the first week, they earned 15 jugs of water, more than the Telkarama well yielded in 3 days. Yuna hid the water in a pit under the tavern floor. Daniel watched as she arranged the jugs, and for the first time, saw neither fear nor businesslike concentration on her face. She was smiling, briefly and quietly, like someone who had remembered what they could do. On the 10th day, Daniel asked her for a copper pipe, and another one, and a piece of tin, and some clay. Yuna asked why. Daniel said he wanted to build a cold box, one that would stay cold on its own, without his hands on the wall. Yuna asked how. Daniel spent 3 hours drawing a diagram with a stick on the clay floor. A double wall of fired clay. Between the walls, a layer of crushed pumice. The air bubbles in the pumice act as a heat insulator. At the bottom, a copper pan. A copper tube is connected to it. The tube goes outside and ends in a ribbed copper sheet. Daniel cools the pan from the inside. Heat is dissipated through the tube to an external radiator. The radiator is hot, but it's on the outside. Inside the box, it's cold. The pumice prevents the heat from returning. Yuna listened. Then she said she didn't understand half of it, but she knows a blacksmith. The blacksmith asked for 3 jugs of water for the job. Yuna bargained him down to 2. 4 days later, the box was ready. Rough, crooked. The clay had cracked in 2 places, and Daniel patched the cracks with a mixture of clay and goat fat. But it worked. Daniel filled it with cold air in 20 minutes. An hour later, the temperature inside had risen by only 2 degrees. The pumice was holding. The box kept the cold without his help for almost a full day. 22 hours. Daniel looked at his first engineering project in this world. A crookedly cobbled-together clay box with a copper tube sticking out of the side. The ugliest refrigerator in the history of both worlds. He stroked its lid. Yuna rented the box to the butcher and the herbalist. The rental price: 1 jug of water a day from each. 2 jugs a day for the box that Daniel fills in 20 minutes in the morning. Yuna was counting in her head. Daniel could see her lips moving. She was thinking 3 moves ahead. A second box, a third, 10, 20. She thought about the scale. Daniel thought about the same thing, but his numbers were different. How many crates he could fill in a morning. How much heat his body could withstand. Where was the limit? Right now, after 20 minutes of work, his back ached for 3 hours. After 40 minutes, he could barely move. An hour of continuous work, and he'd collapse with burns from the inside. He needed an external circuit, a working fluid, a real system, not just bare hands on clay. But a real system required materials. Copper. Lots of copper. And something for the working fluid. Ammonia. Or alcohol. Or at least salt water. He needed money. That is, water. That is, he had to keep working with his hands until his hands built something to replace his hands. A vicious cycle. But a vicious cycle with positive feedback. Every day he earned more. Every earnings provided the resources for the next step. The engineer saw an exponential curve in it. Yuna saw the same thing. She just called it something else. She called it luck. On the 14th day, a caravan arrived in Tel Karam. Lena Haddad's caravan consisted of 12 animals resembling camels, but with longer legs and flat hooves. The locals called them dromas. Lena was tall, a head taller than Daniel. Her skin was dark from the sun, almost black. Her hair was tucked under a heavy turban made of wet fabric. Her voice was loud. She was yelling at the drivers as they unloaded the bales, and Daniel understood about every third word. The rest were clearly profanities. Lena was transporting water. 3 200-liter barrels, 600 liters of water from the well in Red Ravine to Tel Karama. A 4-day journey one way. She lost about a quarter of it along the way. Evaporation through cracks in the barrels. The heat dried out the wood and it cracked. Impregnating it with resin helped, but not completely. Of the 600 liters, 450 made it to Tel Karama, sometimes 400. Lena sat in Yuna's tavern and drank her portion, in small sips. A caravan driver's professional habit. Never drink quickly. Yuna set a plate of meat in front of her. Lena took a bite and froze. She looked at the piece. She sniffed it, took another bite, slowly turned to Yuna. The meat was cold, not cool, cold. Lena knew there was no cellar in Tel Karama deep enough for the meat to be like that. She knew this because she'd been here dozens of times. Yuna said it was a new way of storing it. Lena said she didn't believe it. Yuna shrugged. Lena finished the meat. Then she said she wanted to see this new method. Yuna refused. Lena offered 2 jugs of water for a demonstration. Yuna refused. Lena offered 5. Yuna thought it over. Daniel sat in the back room and listened through the thin wall. His local language was already good enough to grasp the gist. He came out. Lena looked at him, at his skin, at his features. She could tell he was a stranger. Not from these parts, not from the south, not from the north, not from anywhere familiar at all. Daniel sat down across from her and said he had a better offer than a show. He had a question. How much water did she lose per trip? Lena answered automatically. 150 liters, sometimes 200. Daniel nodded. 150 liters, 25% of the cargo, every flight. If he could reduce the loss to 0, how much would she pay? Lena was silent. She was calculating in her head. 150 liters per flight, 8 trips a month. 1,200 liters a month. 1,200 liters is a fortune. That's 3 years of an ordinary person's life. She asked how. Daniel said he needed one of her barrels for 2 days and access to her blacksmith, repairman, who was traveling with the caravan. Lena looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. For the next 2 days, Daniel barely slept. He took the barrel apart, studied its construction, the wood, the leather straps, the resin coating inside. The problem was simple. The wood is porous. The heat dries it out and expands the pores. Water seeps out. It evaporates instantly. Losses are inevitable. The solution was simple too, if he knew thermodynamics. Inside the barrel, he needed a layer that wouldn't let heat through. Then the water inside would stay cool. Cool water creates lower vapor pressure, less vapor, less loss. Daniel took some goat fat, mixed it with pumice powder, stirred it into a smooth paste. He coated the inside of the barrel with a centimeter-thick layer. He let it dry. The pumice bubbles in the fat matrix created insulation, rough, but sufficient. Then he asked a blacksmith to make a thin copper insert, a flat sheet rolled into a cylinder. The insert fit inside the barrel. An air gap, a finger's width thick, remained between the wood with the pumice coating and the copper cylinder. Triple insulation: wood, pumice grease, air, copper. Daniel placed his hands on the bottom of the barrel and cooled the water inside to 10 degrees. His back was burning. 200 liters of water cooling from 35 to 10 degrees generates a lot of heat. A great deal. He worked for nearly an hour with breaks. 3 20-minute sessions. After each one, he lay down on the floor and breathed. Yuna stood nearby and silently poured water over his back. It helped. When he finished, the barrel felt cold to the touch on the outside. Drops of condensation ran down the wood. Lena touched the barrel. She pulled her hand back. She looked at Daniel. There was no fear in her eyes like there was in Yuna's. There was something else in them. Excitement. She asked how long it would last. Daniel said that with good insulation, the water would heat up to 20 degrees in about 4 days. 4 days. Exactly the duration of the flight. Lena did the math. If the water inside was cold, the steam pressure would be minimal. Losses through the wood's pores would drop tenfold. Instead of 150 liters, she would lose 15. Maybe 20. She sat down. No, she was already sitting. She just stopped moving for about 30 seconds. Then she stood up. She walked over to Daniel. She held out her hand, not for a handshake. She clasped his hand with both of hers and held it. Then she said he was coming with her on the next flight. Daniel said he couldn't. He had work here. Crates, the tavern, Yuna. Lena turned to Yuna. Yuna crossed her arms. The two women looked at each other. The conversation lasted a minute. Daniel understood about half of it. Lena was offering a share of the saved water for every trip Daniel would fill up before departure. Yuna demanded a fixed fee, 10 jugs for every barrel filled. Lena haggled. They settled on 8. Daniel stood there listening as the two women divided up his work time without asking his opinion. He wanted to object. Then he thought better of it and didn't. They both understood this world better than he did. 3 days later, Lena left with 3 chilled barrels. Daniel charged all 3 that morning. 3 20-minute sessions with breaks. His back ached all day, but 8 jugs per barrel. 24 jugs that morning. Yuna did the math. She added it to the income from renting out the crates. She looked at Daniel. "We're rich," she said it quietly, not joyfully, warily. Wealth in a world where everyone else is poor isn't a cause for celebration. It's a cause for alarm. Daniel nodded. He understood that too. In the evening, he sat on the roof of the tavern. The sun was setting. The temperature was dropping to 35 degrees. Almost comfortable. Yuna climbed up to him with 2 mugs, water in one. Something was murky and sour in the other. The local equivalent of kvass. She sat down next to him, silently. They drank. Then Yuna said that her husband had been a strong man, kind, intelligent. He died 2 months after the heat wave, not from thirst, from a fever. Her youngest son a week after him, also a fever. The heat didn't kill through thirst. The heat killed because medicine spoiled, food rotted, wounds became infected instantly, antiseptics dried up. The world had become hot, and in a hot world, all living things died faster. She fell silent. Daniel was silent too. He didn't know what to say. Then he said he would build her a cold cellar, a real one, not a box. A room where they could store food and medicine and milk and butter and everything that perishes in the heat. Yuna didn't answer. She watched the sunset. Then she stood up and went downstairs. Daniel stayed on the roof. The knot between his shoulder blades throbbed quietly. The stars here were different, not a single familiar constellation. He lay on the roof in a strange world and thought about copper tubes, about pumice, about ammonia, about where to get ammonia in a world without a chemical industry. Urine. Ammonia can be distilled from urine. It's disgusting, but that's thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is not a squeamish science. He smiled in the darkness and fell asleep right there on the roof. In the morning, Hana woke him up, Yuna's 19-year-old daughter. She leaned out of the skylight and said her mother was calling. Breakfast, work. The boxes won't load themselves. Daniel sat up and rubbed his eyes. Hana looked at him curiously. Then she said her mother had cried during the night. For the first time in 3 years. Not out of grief, she just cried. Hana didn't know why. Daniel knew, but he didn't say anything. He went downstairs and started charging the boxes. 3 weeks later, the first thief appeared in Tel Karam. At night, someone tried to break into the shed where the boxes were stored. He smashed the clay lock on the door. But he didn't manage to carry the box out because it weighed 40 kilograms. Clay and pumice and copper. The thief abandoned it halfway and ran off. Daniel examined the tracks in the morning. Yuna stood nearby and said nothing. It was to be expected. She'd been telling him since day one. Rumors spread. People talk. The butcher told someone. The herbalist told someone else. Lena's caravan drivers saw the cold barrels. Secrets don't last long in the desert. Daniel understood. He needed protection. But he didn't know where to get it. There were 60 people in Tel Karam and not a single fighter. The village survived not by force, but by staying out of sight. Too small to be plundered. Too poor to be conquered. But now there was cold, and that changed everything. 2 days after the attempted theft, Cho Son-mi arrived in Tel Karam. She came on foot, from the desert, just like Daniel 3 weeks ago. But unlike Daniel, she was armed. 2 short sabers at her belt, light leather armor over a wet cloak, and she was wounded, a cut on her left shoulder, deep, inflamed. 3 days without treatment and 50-degree heat. The wound was festering. Daniel saw her first. She was lying against the wall at the entrance to the village, unconscious, small, thin, her face gaunt. If not for the sabers, she could have been mistaken for a teenager. He called out to Yuna. The two of them dragged her into the tavern. Yuna washed the wound with water. She applied her a herbal ointment from the herbalist, bandaged it. Daniel looked at the wound and thought, at this temperature, infection spreads 3 times faster. The bacteria are hot. They're multiplying. If the wound isn't cooled, she'll lose her arm, or her life. He sat down next to her. He placed his palm on the bandage and began to carefully draw out the heat, not from her whole arm, only from the area around the wound. Pinpoint, localized. like cooling a processor. Not the whole case, just the chip. His back got a little warm, just a little. The tissue around the wound cooled to 20 degrees. The inflammation wouldn't disappear instantly, but the cold would slow down the bacteria. It would give the body time to fight. Half an hour later, the redness around the wound had subsided slightly, or so it seemed to him. Yuna watched. Then she asked how he knew what to do. Daniel said that cold is medicine, an old remedy. In his world, people have been applying ice to bruises and inflammations for thousands of years. Yuna asked what ice was. Daniel fell silent. Then he said he'd show her later. Sonmi woke up 6 hours later. She opened her eyes. She saw a ceiling made of poles and fabric. Then she saw Daniel sitting nearby, changing her bandage. Her hand twitched toward her belt. The sabers were gone. Yuna had taken them while she was unconscious. Sonmi tensed her whole body. Daniel raised his hands. The same gesture as on the first day. Palms up. I'm unarmed. Sonmi looked at him, silently, for a minute, 2. Then she relaxed. Not because she trusted him, because she was too weak to fight. For the next 3 days, Daniel tended to her wound. Morning and evening, he cooled the bandage. Yuna changed the ointment. Hana brought food. Sonmi ate in silence. She didn't say thank you. She didn't speak. She just looked. On the 4th day, she spoke. She asked who he was. Daniel said he was an engineer. She didn't know that word. He said he built things. She asked what kind. He said cold ones. She didn't understand. He demonstrated. He took a mug of water. He placed his hand on the wall. A minute later, the water was covered with a thin crust of ice. Sonmi watched. Her face didn't change. No surprise. No fear. Then she said she had served the House of Rin as a bodyguard for the 3rd son. The youngest was 14. The House of Rin traded in water in the west. A competitor to Al-Safar, but smaller. A month ago, the 3rd son saw something he shouldn't have. The father gave the order to eliminate the witness. The witness was 8 years old, a boy from the servants. Sonmi refused. She was declared a deserter. She fled. 2 men were sent after her. She killed one. The second wounded her and fled. She walked for 3 days. She drank from her own supplies. Her supplies ran out in the morning. By evening, she reached the walls of Tel Karama. Daniel listened. Then he said she needed a job. She nodded. He said he needed a guard. He has a warehouse with refrigerated containers. People had already tried to rob him. He needed someone to stand at the door and scare off thieves. Fair pay. Water and food. Sonmi was silent. Then she asked why he wasn't afraid of her. She's a killer. She killed a man 3 days ago. Daniel said she killed the one who came to kill her. That's not murder. It's an engineering problem of survival. Sonmi didn't understand. But something shifted in her face, just a little. She nodded. From that day on, Sonmi slept by the door of the annex with the crates. No one tried to climb in anymore. A week later, Daniel began building a cold cellar. A real one. Not a box. A room. He chose a spot behind the tavern. There was a natural recess in the rock there. A half-meter niche recessed into the stone. Daniel expanded it. More precisely, he supervised the expansion. 3 men from the village whom Yuna had hired for water chiseled away at the stone for 2 days. The result was a small room 2 by 3 meters and 1.5 meters high. A single entrance. Daniel plastered the walls with a mixture of clay and pumice grit. A thick layer, 10 centimeters. Then a second layer of goat fat mixed with sand. Then he let it dry. Then he took the copper sheets that Lena had brought from the Sleeping Gorge at his request. Copper was expensive. 30 jugs of water for 10 sheets. Yuna sighed as she paid. Daniel lined the ceiling of the cubbyhole with copper sheets. He soldered the joints with tin. The result was a copper ceiling. From the ceiling he ran 2 copper tubes outward. The tubes ran up the cliff and ended on the tavern's roof. There he flattened them into flat fins. A radiator. A hot loop. Heat from the cellar rises up through the tubes and is released through the fins on the roof. It was cold down in the cellar. It was hot up on the roof. Daniel heated the cellar. 30 minutes of work. His back was burning. Yuna poured water on his back. The temperature inside the small room dropped to 8 degrees. Daniel came out of the cellar and sat down on a rock. Yuna went inside. She was in there a long time, about 5 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were wet. She didn't say anything, but that evening, on the table in front of Daniel, there was a plate he hadn't seen before. Meat, but not just roasted. The meat was stewed, with herbs. with fat that glistened and smelled of something complex and lingering. Butter. Yuna had used butter that could now be stored, and cream, and fresh herbs from the pot on the windowsill that she had moved to the cellar, where they had finally stopped drying out and dying. Daniel tasted it. The flavor was such that he put down his spoon and just sat there for a few seconds. It wasn't what he'd been used to eating over the past month. It was what someone who loved to cook would make. Not for survival, for joy. Yuna stood at the stove with her back to him. She didn't turn around. Hana sat in the corner and looked at her mother, then at Daniel, then at her mother again, and she smiled slowly. The first real smile in the 3 weeks Daniel had been living there. Daniel ate everything down to the last drop. Then he said it was the best meal he'd ever tasted in his life. And he wasn't lying. Yuna nodded briefly without turning around, but her shoulders relaxed just a little. Just a little. Sonmi sat by the door, cleaning her saber. She wasn't eating. She'd eaten her portion earlier, but she saw, and something flashed across her impassive face. Something like envy. Not for the food, for the warmth in this room. For the simple human warmth she hadn't felt since she was 14. In the 6th week, Daniel built his first condenser. The idea was simple. Air contains water, even here, even at 5% humidity. You need to cool the surface below the dew point, and the water will condense on its own. The problem was scale. He already knew how to cool a small stone in the desert. There were drops, but drops don't quench the village's thirst. He needed a process, an automatic one. Or at least a semi-automatic one. He needed a condenser. He thought about it for a week. He drew diagrams on clay shards. He did the math in his head. He didn't have a calculator. He didn't have paper. He didn't have reference books. But he had 6 years of designing refrigeration systems and a memory that recalled tables and formulas better than his colleagues' faces. At night, the humidity rose. Not much. From 5 to 10%, sometimes up to 12. The temperature dropped to 35. The dew point at 35 degrees and 10% humidity, about 0 degrees. He needed to cool the copper sheet down to 0, and dew would start to form on it. 0 is easier than -10, much easier. Daniel took the largest copper sheet of the remaining ones, 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter. He carried it to the cellar, hung it from ropes attached to the ceiling. He placed the clay bowl underneath it. He closed the door, sat down next to it, placed his hands on the sheet, and began to draw out the heat. Slowly, steadily. Just as he had grown accustomed to over these past weeks, the sheet was cooling. The air in the cellar was already cool. 8 degrees. The sheet dropped to 5, to 3, to 1, to 0, and droplets appeared on the copper surface. Tiny, frequent. They gathered into little streams and flowed down to the bottom edge of the sheet. From the edge, they fell into the bowl. Drip, drip, drip. Daniel sat and listened. It was the most beautiful sound of his life. More beautiful than any music, more beautiful than anything else. The sound of water appearing out of nothing, out of the air, for free. He held the sheet for 40 minutes. Then his back started to burn, and he stopped. There were about 300 milliliters in the bowl. 1/3 of a liter in 40 minutes. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The village needs at least 200 liters a day. At this rate, he'd have to work nonstop for 26 hours. That's impossible. An hour of continuous work, and he passes out. He needs to change his approach. He needs more cooling surface area. The system needs to run on its own, without his hands on the metal. Daniel sat in the cellar and stared at the bowl of water. 1/3 of a liter, a pitiful amount. But the concept works. We need to scale it up. For the next 10 days, he built. Yuna gave him a second small room next to the cellar. Lena brought copper, lots of copper, 50 sheets. It cost a fortune. Yuna paid for it from the savings she'd made from renting crates and charging barrels. She didn't complain. She saw the 300 milliliters in the bowl and did the math in her head. Daniel worked with the blacksmith of Tel Karama. The old man's name was Rashid. Rashid had golden hands and a complete lack of understanding of what this strange stranger wanted from him. Daniel drew diagrams. Rashid cursed. Daniel explained. Rashid cursed again, but he did it. They assembled a structure out of 50 copper sheets mounted vertically with a gap of 2 fingers, like blinds. Under each sheet was a trough made of clay smeared with grease. The troughs converged into a single channel. The channel led to a barrel. Daniel called it a condenser battery. Rashid called it madness. The system stood in a basement that Daniel had dug out specifically for it, deeper than a cellar. 2 meters underground. It was 5 degrees cooler here than on the surface. 30 degrees instead of 35 at night. Every degree counted. Daniel cooled the battery once a day. In the evening before sunset, 40 minutes of work. He placed his hands on the central sheet and drew the heat through the entire structure. Copper is an excellent conductor. The cold spread from the center to the edges. All 50 sheets cooled down to zero at about the same time. The cooling area. 50 sheets at 25 square meters each. 12.5 square meters. 25 times larger than a single sheet. And the system kept running without him. After charging, the copper remained cold for 4 hours. The pumice insulation on the walls kept the heat out. 4 hours of condensation on 12.5 square meters. The first night. Daniel charged the battery at sunset. His back was burning. Yuna was watering. He left the basement and lay down on the ground. 4 hours later, he went down to check. The barrel under the gutters was a quarter full. He lifted it, heavy, about 3 liters. 3 liters of pure water from the air in a single night. Daniel stood in the basement holding the barrel. 3 liters. Not 300 milliliters, 3 liters, 10 times more. And this was just the beginning. If he increased the battery capacity, 100 sheets, 200. If he dug deeper, if he improved the insulation, if he found a way to cool it without using his hands. He set the barrel down and went upstairs. Yuna was waiting. He said 3 liters. Yuna closed her eyes. 3 liters of free water per night. The Tel Karama well yielded 2 buckets a day, about 20 liters. 3 liters is 15% of the well's output. For free, out of thin air. Yuna opened her eyes. There was neither fear nor surprise in them. There was calculation. She asked how much it would take to produce 20 liters a night. Daniel did the math. About 350 sheets, plus a basement 3 times that size, plus insulation. At least 6 months of work and copper that would have to be hauled in by caravans from Red Ravine. Yuna nodded. Then she asked how much it would take to produce 200 liters a night. Daniel looked at her. 200 liters. That's more than the entire well. That's the end of the water monopoly within a 50-kilometer radius. Yuna looked at him, calmly, without emotion. She wasn't asking out of a dream. She was asking like someone drawing up a business plan. Daniel said that for 200 liters, he needed copper. A lot of copper. He needed ammonia, or another working fluid. He needs a system that will work without his constant involvement. A mechanical compressor, or at least a wood-fired absorption loop. He needs a workshop. He needs people. He needs knowledge of this world's underground resources, where the copper ore is, where the sulfur is, where the saltpeter is. He needs a map. Yuna was silent. Then she said she knew one person, a caravan driver who had traveled north, far to the north, into the mountains. There, in the caves, live people who mine copper ore. They are poor. They drink condensation from the rocks, but they have copper, as much as you want. Daniel asked how far it was. Yuna said 3 weeks one way. Daniel leaned back against the wall. 3 weeks. In the desert. He had never once ventured beyond the borders of Tel Karama. He was afraid. But fear isn't data, and the data said that without copper, he'd hit a wall in 2 months. A 50-sheet capacitor is the absolute limit of what can be made here. The next step requires scale. And scale requires resources, and the resources are in the north. Daniel looked at Yuna. She was looking at him. Between them was an understanding that required no words. He would go. But first he had to do something else. He had to teach Hana how to charge the capacitor. Not with her own power. Hana didn't have an effector. But there was another way. Evaporative cooling. A wet rag in the wind gets cold. Anyone who's ever stepped out of a pool knows that. Daniel will build a second system. A simple one. No effector. Pure physics. Wet rags on copper sheets. The night breeze. Evaporation draws away heat. The sheets cool down. Water condenses on the underside. The efficiency will be lower, maybe a liter a night instead of 3. But it's a liter that doesn't require his presence. He spent 3 days building the second array, a small one, 10 sheets, on the tavern roof. He taught Hana to wet the rags and hang them on the sheets before sunset. In the morning, to collect the water from the gutters, Hana picked it up quickly. She didn't understand why it worked, but she memorized the steps and asked questions, lots of questions. Why is wet stuff cold? Why does water drip from below and not from above? Why is there more at night than during the day? Daniel answered, briefly, in simple words, and every time he saw something light up in her eyes, a spark. She wasn't just memorizing, she was thinking. On the fourth day, Hana came to him and said that if they placed the sheets at an angle instead of flat, the water would drain faster and collect at a single point, rather than spreading across the entire surface. Daniel froze. He looked at her. She was right. Absolutely right. The angle increases the flow rate. The droplets don't linger on the surface. They don't have time to evaporate back. Collection is more efficient. He rebuilt the mounts in an hour. The sheets were set at a 15-degree angle. The next night, the battery yielded 200 milliliters more. Hana stood nearby and smiled, widely, from ear to ear. Daniel said she was a natural. Hana snorted and said he was a nerd, but she left satisfied. Yuna watched from the doorway. Daniel caught her gaze. There was something warm and heavy in it at the same time. Then Yuna left. A week later, Lena returned. A caravan of 12 dromes. She brought copper, 20 sheets, and news. Bad news. 2 days' journey south of here, people from the house of Al-Safar had appeared. 3 of them. Scouts. They were asking about a man who makes cold. About a stranger in a small village. Someone had told them. One of Yuna's clients, or one of Lena's drivers, or someone else. It doesn't matter. The word got out. Al-Safar knows. Lena sat in the tavern and spoke quickly. Her hands clenched the mug. She was angry, not scared. Angry, exactly. Al-Safar isn't a gang. It's the House of Wells, one of the 3 largest on the continent. They have an army. They have money. They have spies in every settlement. If they decide that Daniel is a threat to their monopoly, they won't send scouts. They'll send killers. Or envoys with an offer he can't refuse. Daniel listened. Sonmi stood by the door, motionless, but her hands were on the hilts of her sabers. Yuna was silent. Hana sat in the corner and for the first time looked frightened. Daniel thought he had maybe 2 months, maybe less. 2 months before Al-Safar sent someone serious. In 2 months, he needed to become too useful to be killed, or too strong to be forced, or to go where they wouldn't find him. He chose the 4th option. He said they would all leave together, north, into the mountains, to where the copper ore and the caves are. He would build there what couldn't be built here. Not a cellar, not a box, not a 50-sheet battery. A city. A cold city in the rock. Yuna raised an eyebrow. Lena whistled. Sonmi didn't move. Hana asked how. Daniel said he didn't know yet, but he knows physics, and physics says it's possible. If there's a mountain, if there's copper, if there are people, if there's time. Yuna stood up. She walked over to him. She looked down at him. She was a head taller. Then she said he was an idiot. Then she said she was going with him. Lena said she was too, because someone had to haul his copper madness on their dromes. Sonmi nodded. Once. Silently. Hana jumped up and said that if they left her behind, she'd run away and catch up. Daniel looked at them. At the 4 women who had decided to follow an engineer from another world into the mountains to build the impossible. He wanted to say something important, something worthy of the moment. Instead, he said they needed to take all the copper sheets, every single one. The caravan left Tel Karama an hour before dawn. 12 dromones, 6 loaded with copper sheets and tools, 3 with barrels of water, 2 with food and cloth, 1 empty for those who couldn't walk. Lena led the column. She knew the northern route. She had traveled it 4 times in the last 2 years. 3 weeks' journey through the rocky desert, then across the salt flats, then up the dry riverbed into the foothills. Daniel walked alongside the lead drome. Sonmi walked beside him, 2 sabers at her belt, eyes on the horizon. Yuna rode the second drome, Hana the third. 11 more people had left Tel Karama with them, families who had nothing to lose. Old Rashid, the blacksmith, his wife, a herbalist with 2 children, Lena's 2 herdsmen, the butcher who had rented a crate, his sister. 73 people remained in the village. Yuna left them the second condenser on the roof, the one that worked without an effector, by evaporation. A liter of water per night. Not much, but at least something. She explained to the village elder how to change the rags and collect the water. The village elder listened and nodded. He didn't thank her. He watched the departing caravan like a man who knows he's being abandoned. Daniel didn't look back. If he had, he would have stayed, and staying was out of the question. The first 3 days were the hardest. During the day, the temperature rose to 58 degrees. The caravan moved only at dawn and after sunset. In between, everyone lay under tents made of wet cloth and waited. Daniel cooled the water barrels every morning. 30 minutes of work for 3 barrels. His back was on fire. Yuna watered the plants. Routine. But without that, the water would heat up to 40 degrees, and drinking it would be torture. On the 4th day, the drum carrying the food began to limp. Lena examined its leg. A crack in the hoof. A stone had lodged between the pads. Lena cursed in 3 languages as she pulled the stone out. Daniel stood nearby. Then he asked if he could treat the wound. The cold would reduce the swelling and speed up healing. Lena looked at him, then at the drum. Then she nodded. Daniel placed his hand on the animal's leg. The drum flinched. Lena held him by the lead. Daniel drew out the heat. Precisely. Just like with Sonmi's wound. The tissue around the crack cooled. The drum stopped twitching. 10 minutes later, the swelling had noticeably gone down. Lena bandaged the hoof with oiled cloth. By evening, the drum was walking normally. Lena sat down next to Daniel by the fire. The fire was small. Fuel in the desert consists of dry roots that Hana gathered along the way. Lena was silent for a long time. Then she said she used to have a caravan of 30 dromes. 4 years ago. The largest private caravan on the southern route. She hauled water from 6 wells, 400 trips in 2 years. Then a drought within a drought struck. 3 wells dried up in a month. There was half as much water. Prices skyrocketed. People started fighting over the sources. The House of Al-Safar took the 2 remaining wells. They offered Lena a contract. Carry only our water, at our prices. Lena refused. Al-Safar cut off her access to the wells. Of the 30 dromedaries, 12 remained. She sold the rest to buy water from middlemen. Half the drivers left. Those who stayed worked for food and a share. Lena fell silent. Then she said that 2 years ago her caravan had been carrying water to a refugee camp in the west. 500 people, women, children, the elderly. They waited for 3 days. Lena was half a day late. The axle broke on the pass. When she reached the camp, 43 were still alive. The rest had died of dehydration, in half a day. Because at 50 degrees, half a day without water means death. Lena didn't cry. She told this in a steady voice, like a report. Then she said that since then, she's been sleeping 4 hours a day. She drives faster than anyone else. She doesn't take on more cargo than she can deliver on time. And yet, every time she pulls up to the next village, for the first 10 seconds, she can't bring herself to look. Are they alive? Did they wait? Daniel was silent. Then he said he would build her a tanker, not a barrel. A tanker on wheels, insulated, with internal cooling, one where the water wouldn't lose a single degree over the 4-day journey, and wouldn't evaporate a single drop. Lena looked at him, for a long time. Then she said he was a strange man, and went to sleep. On the 7th day, they entered the salt flats, a white, flat plain stretching from horizon to horizon. Salt crunched under their feet. The sun's reflection off the white surface was blinding. Everyone wrapped cloth around their faces, slits for the eyes. Daniel walked and felt the salt eating away at the skin on his ankles. His boots from Seattle had fallen apart back in Tel Karam. Yuna had given him some local leather sandals. The sandals offered little protection against the salt. On the 9th day, one of the drivers lost consciousness. Heat stroke. Daniel rushed to him. He placed his hands on the man's head and neck. He drew out the heat, quickly, aggressively. His back flared up. The driver's body temperature dropped from 41 to 38 in 3 minutes. Daniel collapsed to the side and lay there for 5 minutes, unable to move. His back was red from his shoulder blades to his lower back. Yuna poured water over him. The driver came to an hour later. Lena gave him water and sat him on an empty drome. Daniel lay in the shade of the awning and thought about how he needed a better way to dissipate heat. His body couldn't handle it. The skin on his back was covered in tiny blisters, internal burns. The effector was pumping heat through his tissues, and the tissues were burning. He needed an external circuit, right now, not sometime later in the workshop, right now in the desert, using whatever was available. He sat up. He asked Lena for a copper flask, a piece of leather cord, a wet rag. He strapped the flask to his back between his shoulder blades, filled it with water, wrapped it in the rag. Now when he drew heat, it didn't pass through his skin, but through the flask. The water in the flask heated up. The cloth on the outside evaporated the moisture and cooled the flask. A cycle, rough, but it worked. He tried to cool a mug of water. His back remained warm but didn't burn. The flask heated up. The cloth hissed from the evaporation. It works, Daniel laughed. Lena asked what was so funny. He said he'd just invented a portable radiator out of a flask and a rag. She said he was crazy. He agreed. On the 13th day, they left the salt flats. Mountains rose ahead, dark, riddled with gorges. The first sign of green, not green in the usual sense. Gray-green lichens on rocks in the shade of the crevices. But it was life. Plant life. Daniel plucked a piece of lichen and rubbed it between his fingers. Moist. These rocks held moisture. The rock was porous. Pumice. Volcanic rock. They absorbed the night's moisture and released it slowly. A natural condenser. Nature was doing the same thing he was, only more. Daniel looked up at the mountains. Somewhere inside that massif there was a place, a large cave, or a cave system, deep enough to stay cool, high enough to build, with openings to the surface for ventilation and heat dissipation. Somewhere out there was his city. He didn't know exactly where yet, but he knew he would find it, because the mountains themselves were telling him. Lichen grew where there was moisture. Moisture was where the rock was porous and the shade was deep. Deep shade meant deep crevices. Deep crevices meant caves. Logic. Engineering logic. He was heading toward the mountains, and for the first time in 6 weeks in this world, he felt neither fear nor anxiety. He felt anticipation. On the 15th day, the caravan encountered people. Mountain miners. A small group of 7. Thin, dirty, their skin gray with dust. They mined copper ore in the tunnels on the mountainside and came down once every 2 months to trade the copper for water and food. Lena knew their leader, a man named Tariq. He was surprised to see the caravan here, at this time of year, with so many people. Lena said they had a proposal. Tariq listened. Daniel stood nearby and said nothing. Lena explained briefly. This man makes cold, makes water out of air, wants to build a city inside the mountain. He needs copper, lots of copper. He pays with water. Tariq looked at Daniel. Then he said he'd heard better stories. Daniel asked for a mug. Any mug. Tariq held out his own, a dirty copper mug. Daniel placed his hand on the bottom. 10 seconds. The water inside had formed a crust of ice. Tariq looked at the mug, then at Daniel, then back at the mug. Then he drank the icy water in one gulp. And his eyes became the way Daniel had grown accustomed to seeing people's eyes after the first trick. Wide, wet, hungry, not from thirst, from hope. Tariq said he knew of a cave, a big one, in Mount Karshun, a 3-day journey from here up the gorge. Miners had found it a year ago but hadn't started mining it. Too deep, too big. Why waste energy on a cave when ore is needed? But for the city. Tariq fell silent. Then he said that if the stranger could really do what he'd shown, Tariq and his men would go with him, all 7 of them. Daniel nodded. The caravan moved on. Now there were 34 people in it. The Karshun cave opened up on the 3rd day of the ascent. The entrance was in a crevice between 2 rocky outcrops at an altitude of about 1,000 meters above the plain. Narrow. 2 people could stand shoulder to shoulder. But beyond the entrance lay a corridor that widened with every step. After 20 meters, the corridor opened into a hall. Daniel stopped at the threshold of the hall and raised his torch. The ceiling rose 12 meters high. The walls were made of gray limestone veined with quartz. The floor was relatively even. There was a slight slope toward the far wall. And the temperature. Daniel felt it with his whole body. 26 degrees, 52 outside, 26 inside the cave. A difference of 26 degrees, simply due to the depth of the rock. The stone retained the coolness it had absorbed overnight and released it slowly. Natural thermal insulation. The meters of rock between the surface and the cave acted like the wall of a refrigerator. Daniel walked through the chamber and took measurements. The area was roughly 300 square meters. The height was 12 meters. Volume, 3,600 cubic meters. If the temperature is lowered to 18 degrees, a difference of 8 degrees. Air volume, 3,600 cubic meters. Air density, approximately 1 kilogram per cubic meter. Specific heat capacity of air, 1 kilojoule per kilogram per degree. 3,600 multiplied by 8, 28,800 kilojoules, plus the walls. The mass of the stone is enormous, but the stone is already cool. Only the air and the top layer of the surface need to be cooled. Maybe 50,000 kilojoules in total. At a power of half a kilowatt, that's 100,000 seconds. About 28 hours of continuous operation. With breaks and a heat sink, maybe 3 days. But this is a one-time job. After the initial cooling, the rock will maintain the temperature on its own. It only needs to be once a day, maybe once every 2 days. The cave worked in his favor. For the first time since arriving in this world, physics was on his side rather than against him. He went deeper. Beyond the main chamber were corridors, 3 directions. The left one led to a system of small caves, each the size of a room, perfect for living quarters. The right one went down and, after 50 meters, ended in a dead end with a wet wall. Wet. Daniel pressed his palm against the wall. Moisture. Groundwater seeping through the rock. Not a stream, not a brook, a slow drip, but constant. He stood by the wall for 5 minutes and collected about 10 milliliters in his palm. The water was clear, cool, with a slight mineral taste. Daniel closed his eyes. Water in the wall, copper in the mountains, a naturally insulated cave, an entrance that was easy to defend, elevation that provided coolness. It was the perfect place. Not just good, perfect. He returned to the main hall. Everyone was standing and waiting. Yuna, Lena, Sonmi, Hana, Tarek. 34 people in the semi-darkness of the cave were looking at him. Daniel said one word. Here. Work began that very day. First, Daniel divided the people into groups. Tarek and his miners expanded the side caves. They chiseled away at the walls. They leveled the floors. Each room was 3 by 4 meters, enough for a family. Rashid the blacksmith set up his workshop in one of the small caves. Daniel drew him a diagram of a furnace with a chimney venting through a natural crack in the ceiling. The hot air rose up through the crack in the rock. The draft was excellent. Yuna took the largest of the small caves and declared it the kitchen. She hauled in stones for the hearth. She found clay near the entrance. She molded shelves. 2 days later, the cave smelled of food. Lena unloaded the caravan. The copper sheets were stacked against the wall of the main hall. 50 sheets from Tel Karama, plus 20 she'd brought on her last trip. 70. Plus Tariq had promised ore from the mine. A smelter. We need a smelter. Rashid said he could do it. Daniel drew him a furnace. A simple one. Clay walls, charcoal, bellows for the blast. Copper ore melts at 1080 degrees. Charcoal gives a maximum of 900. We need additives. Flux. Daniel asked Tariq if there was limestone in the mountains. Tariq laughed and pointed to the cave walls. They were standing inside limestone. Limestone, used as a flux, lowers the melting point. 900 degrees with flux would be enough for crude copper, not pure, but sufficient for sheets and tubes. Daniel felt the system coming together in his head. Ore from the mine, a smelter in the cave. A blacksmith shapes sheets and tubes. The sheets go to a condenser battery, the tubes to a heat dissipation system. The battery produces water. The water goes to the people. The people work. Work produces copper. Copper goes to the battery. A cycle. A closed cycle with positive feedback. An exponential function. A week later, he began cooling the main hall. 3 days, 10 hours a day with breaks. A flask radiator on his back. Yuna dampened a rag every 20 minutes. Kana stood next to the goatskin notebook and wrote down everything he said aloud. And he talked a lot. He muttered calculations under his breath. The wall temperature at a depth of 1 centimeter. Heat flux through a square meter of limestone. Thermal conductivity coefficient. Air convection velocity in a closed volume. Hana didn't understand a word, but she wrote it down. Every number, every term. She asked how to spell heat capacity. Daniel spelled it out letter by letter. She wrote it down using symbols from the local alphabet. It looked strange, but she memorized it. On the 3rd day, the main hall had cooled to 18 degrees. Daniel stood in the center and breathed. The air was cool, clean. It smelled of stone and a hint of moisture. 18 degrees. The perfect room temperature. In a world where it was 55 outside, people entered the hall and paused, as if stepping into cold water, carefully, step by step. Rashid's wife sat down on the floor and began to sway, quietly, without a word. One of Lena's drivers took off his cape for the first time in 3 years and stood with bare arms and closed eyes, just standing there. The children of the herb gatherers ran around the hall and laughed. They didn't understand why all the adults were acting so strange. To them, it was just a cave, a cool cave. They were 5 and 7 years old. They were born after the heat. They didn't remember it ever being any other way. For them, 18 degrees wasn't a return to the past. It was a discovery. Yuna stood by the wall and didn't move. Daniel approached her. She was staring at the floor. He asked if everything was all right. She said she'd remembered her home, her real home, before the heat. It was the same there, cool, quiet. It smelled like food. Her husband was sitting by the window. The children were playing. She was cooking. An ordinary evening. She hadn't thought about it for 7 years. She'd forced herself to forget. And now she remembered, because the air was the same. She fell silent. Daniel didn't know what to say. He put his hand on her shoulder, gently, for a second. Yuna didn't move. Then she straightened up and went into the kitchen. An hour later, the smell of stewed meat with herbs wafted through the cave. Daniel set up the capacitor bank in the lower corridor, 70 sheets, next to the damp wall. The humidity here was higher than in the main hall. Not 5%, 15, maybe 20. The proximity of the groundwater saturated the air. The dew point was rising. He needed to cool the sheets not to 0, but only to 10. 10 degrees. It was easy. He charged the battery in 20 minutes. His back had barely warmed up. 4 hours later, there were 8 liters in the barrel under the gutters. 8 liters. Not 3 like in Tel Karam. 8. Humidity, area, and temperature worked together. Daniel sat down by the barrel and did the math. If he doubled the battery, 140 sheets. If they worked twice a day, morning and evening. If Rashid smelted more copper from the ore, 20 liters a day, 30, 50, 100. In 3 months, at the current rate of smelting and assembly, 200 liters a day. 200 liters of free water. For 34 people, that's 6 liters per person. A luxury. An unimaginable luxury. In a world where the dust people drink wrung-out rags, 6 liters per person a day. Yuna walked over and peered into the barrel. Then she looked at him. Then she said that by the end of the month, people would start coming. Not because she would call them, because word would get around. Water, coolness, food, people will come. And she asked if he was ready for it. Daniel said no. Yuna nodded. Then she said she was ready. And she went off to count the supplies. Daniel stayed by the barrel and listened to the water dripping from the copper sheets. Drip, drip, drip. The most beautiful sound in both worlds. Yuna was right. People began arriving in the 3rd week. The first to arrive were miners from the neighboring mountain. 8 people. They had heard from Tariq that there was water and coolness in Karshun. They came to see. They stayed. Then a family came from the south, a husband, a wife, and 3 children. They had walked for a week. They carried everything they owned on their backs, 2 sacks of clothes, a jug with the last of their water. They'd heard from a caravan driver who'd heard from someone who'd heard from Lena. Then more and more. By the end of the first month, 70 people were living in Prokhlada. By the end of the second, 120. Yuna ran everything. Daniel built. Yuna organized. She assigned people to their tasks. Miners in the tunnels, women in the kitchen and in the caves. Children carried water and small tools. Men on the construction site. Everyone received their share of water. 2 liters a day per adult. 1 liter per child. Yuna kept track on clay tablets. Who worked how much? Who received how much? Who owed? Who was in the black? She did not allow debts to exceed 3 days. Anyone who did not work for 3 days without a reason had to leave. The rule was strict, but fair. Daniel didn't interfere. He understood that Yuna knew people better than he did. He knew thermodynamics. She knew human nature. Together, they covered both fronts. The capacitor bank was growing. Rashid smelted copper every day. Rough, with impurities, but it worked. Hana helped Daniel install the new sheets. She mastered soldering in a week. Her hands were more precise than Rashid's, more delicate, neater. Daniel showed her how to solder with tin. She made her first joint, crooked. The second was straighter. The third was almost perfect. By the 5th day, she was soldering better than he was. Daniel told her so. She snorted and said he was just a bad solderer. He agreed. She was right. He was a designer, not an installer. At his old job, he drew schematics while others assembled the equipment. Here, there were no others. Now there was Hana. By the end of the 2nd month, the battery had grown to 200 plates. Daniel charged it twice a day, morning and evening, for 30 minutes each time, with a flask radiator strapped to his back. Output had increased to 30 liters a day. 30 liters for 120 people. Not much, but the groundwater in the wall provided another 20 liters, 50 in total. Plus, Lena brought barrels from the southern wells every 2 weeks. It was livable. Not luxurious, but livable. Daniel thought about the next step. A condenser on copper sheets is good, but it still depends on him, on his hands, on his effector. He needs a system that works without him. An absorption refrigerator. He knew the principle by heart. Ammonia evaporates, it absorbs heat, it condenses back, it releases heat. A cycle. No moving parts, no compressor needed, just a heat source for distillation. A fire. Firewood. Coal. The problem was the ammonia. Where to get ammonia? Daniel had been thinking about this since Tel Karama. The answer was unpleasant, but the only one. Urine. Human urine contains urea. When heated with lime, urea releases ammonia. Ammonia can be collected in water. This produces ammonia water. Ammonia water can be distilled into pure ammonia. Disgusting, but possible. He explained the plan to Yuna. Yuna listened. She didn't flinch. She had survived 7 years of the scorching. The disgusting ceased to be disgusting when every drop counted. She organized the collection. Clay pots in a separate cave. The smell was monstrous, but it was raw material. Daniel built a distillation apparatus. Simple. A clay pot over a fire, a lid with a tube. The tube ran through a container of cold water. Cooling, condensation. The result was an ammonia solution. Weak, 5%, but enough to start with. He distilled for 3 days. He obtained 2 liters of concentrated solution. Then he began building an absorption loop. It was the most complex structure he had ever built in this world. A closed system of copper tubes, a generator, a condenser, evaporator, absorber. The ammonia water solution is heated in the generator. The ammonia evaporates and travels through a tube to the condenser. There it cools and becomes liquid. The liquid ammonia passes through a throttle valve into the evaporator. The pressure drops. The ammonia evaporates again. It draws heat from the surrounding air. Cold. Real cold without an effector. Just fire and chemistry. The ammonia vapor flows into the absorber, where it is absorbed by water. The solution returns to the generator. The cycle is complete. Rashid soldered the tubes according to Daniel's drawings and cursed non-stop. The joints leaked. The ammonia stank. The tubes burst from the pressure. Daniel reworked them. Again and again. 6 attempts. On the 7th, the circuit worked. A fire under the generator, gurgling in the tubes, and on the surface of the evaporator. A copper cube the size of a head. Frost appeared. Without Daniel's hands, without the effector. Frost from fire and urine and copper. Daniel sat on the workshop floor and looked at the frost. Rashid stood nearby and looked too. Then Rashid said that in 5-10 years of working with metal, he'd seen a lot of strange things. But cold from fire was the strangest. Daniel said it wasn't strange. It was thermodynamics. Rashid said he didn't know that word, but he didn't like it. Hana ran over when she heard. She saw the frost. She touched it with her finger, pulled her hand back, laughed. Then she sat down next to Daniel and said she wanted to understand how it worked. Everything, from start to finish. Daniel began to explain. Hana listened. She took notes. She asked questions. He explained until morning. By dawn, Hana had a goatskin notebook filled with writing on both sides. The first set of notes on thermodynamics in the history of Solaris. The absorption loop was weak. It produced just enough cold to cool 5 cubic meters of air by 10 degrees per hour. Not much, but it was cold without Daniel. Anyone who knew how to tend a fire could run this circuit. Anyone. That changed everything. Daniel was no longer an indispensable link. He was a source of knowledge. But knowledge can be passed on. He began teach. Hana was the first, then Tariq, then Rashid's wife, who turned out to be more attentive than her husband, then 3 miners. Daniel drew diagrams on the cave walls, with chalk made from local limestone, white lines on gray stone, arrows, numbers, names he made up on the spot, translating English terms into the local language. The evaporator became an icy stone. The condenser became a hot wall. The absorber became a drinking jug. Hana wrote down all the translations. In a week, she could assemble the absorption circuit herself, with Rashid's help. Without Daniel, she assembled it. It worked. Worse than the one Daniel had assembled. The tubes were crooked. The joints leaked more, but it worked. Frost on the evaporator, cold from the fire. Hana stood next to her circuit, her hands trembling. Not from the cold, from the realization. She had built something that did the impossible. With her own hands. From blueprints, she understood. Daniel stood in the workshop doorway and watched her. Then he quietly left. He didn't want to get in the way. This was her moment. In the 4th month, the embassy of the House of Al-Safar arrived in the cool. 3 people. 2 guards in leather armor with short spears. And a woman. A young woman. In silk garments that looked ridiculous on a mountain trail. Aisha Al-Safar, the 3rd daughter of the head of the house. Sonmi met them at the entrance to the gorge. She stood on a rock with 2 sabers in her hands and waited. The guards stopped. They were professionals. They knew how a person who knew how to kill stood. Sonmi stood exactly like that. Aisha stepped forward. She said she had come in peace, on her father's behalf. Zayd al-Safar, head of the House of Wells, invites the Lord of Coolness to negotiations. Aisha spoke beautifully, smoothly, like someone who had been taught to speak from birth. Every word in its place. Every pause was measured. Daniel listened. He stood at the entrance to the cave next to Yuna. Yuna was silent, but Daniel saw her jaw clench. She knew what an al-Safar embassy meant. First the envoys, then the terms, then the ultimatum, then the army. Daniel invited Aisha inside. He asked the guards to wait outside. Sonmi remained at the entrance. She looked at the guards. They looked at her. No one moved. Aisha entered the main hall and stopped. She stood in the coolness and didn't move for 10 seconds, then 20. Then she closed her eyes. Daniel watched. He had seen this dozens of times. Every new person reacted the same way. The body remembered the coolness even if the mind had forgotten. The muscles relaxed. Breathing slowed. Shoulders dropped. The body said thank you faster than the lips. Aisha opened her eyes. Her face was calm, but her hands trembled slightly. She asked what the temperature was here. Daniel said 18 degrees. Aisha nodded. Then she began to speak, formally, like an ambassador. Zayd al-Safar proposes an alliance. Coolness will become a partner of the house. Daniel will receive protection from the other houses, access to trade routes, status. In return, Daniel will transfer cooling and condensation technology to the house, plus 20% of all the water produced by Coolness, plus the house's right to station its people inside. Daniel listened. Then he asked what would happen if he refused. Aisha paused. Then she said that her father wasn't used to refusals. Daniel nodded. Then he said the answer was no. Not because he didn't want the alliance, but because the terms meant a loss of independence. And independence was the only thing Proclata had. Aisha wasn't surprised. It was as if she had been expecting that answer. Then she said she would stay for a week, as a guest, to better understand Coolness and give her father a full report. Daniel agreed. Yuna was against it. She said the girl was a spy, that she would be counting people and supplies and fortifications, that in a week, al-Safar would know everything. Daniel said let him know. Let him see. Let him see that you can't steal the cold. The cold isn't a thing, it's knowledge. You can kill Daniel, but Khan already knows how to build circuits. And Rashid, and the 3 miners. Knowledge is spreading. You can't stuff it back in. Yuna snorted, but she didn't argue. Aisha hadn't spent a week in the Coolness. She'd spent 3. On the 3rd day, she took off her silk clothes and put on a local work smock. On the 5th day, she came to Yuna's kitchen and asked for work. Yuna gave her a knife and a bag of root vegetables. Peel. Aisha peeled, slowly, clumsily. She cut her finger twice. She didn't complain. On the 7th day, she went to Daniel's workshop. She stood by the door and watched as he and Hana assembled a new circuit. Hana was explaining to Rashid where to solder the connection. Daniel was drawing a diagram of the next level on the wall. A large absorption circuit. For 10 cooling units, for the new residential wing. Aisha looked at the diagram. Then she said she didn't understand a single symbol, but she could see that it was beautiful. Daniel turned around. She was standing in the doorway. The light from the torch fell on her face. Without silk and without jewelry, she looked different, younger, simpler, more human. He asked what she meant. She said that the lines on the wall were like music, each connected to the other, each in its place, like notes. Daniel had never heard anyone call engineering diagrams music. He said it wasn't music, it was math. She asked what the difference was. He opened his mouth, closed it, he thought, and couldn't come up with a good answer. On the 10th day, Aisha asked Daniel what he liked to do. Just like that. Not to survive, not for the cool, for himself. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he said he couldn't remember. For the past 4 months, he hadn't done anything for himself. Every hour of every day was work. Aisha nodded. Then, on the 13th day, Daniel asked her, "What do you like to do?" Aisha froze, for a long time. Then she said she didn't know, that no one had ever asked her that she had been taught to be useful to the house, to play an instrument for guests, to speak 5 languages for negotiations, to be beautiful for a profitable marriage. But no one had ever asked what she wanted. Daniel was silent. Then he said he had a free wall in his workshop, and chalk. If she wanted, she could come and draw. Anything. Lines, diagrams, music, anything. Aisha didn't answer. She left. 2 days later, she came to the workshop and asked for chalk. She didn't draw. She said she wanted to learn to calculate, not the household accounting she'd been taught to manage the home. Real math. The kind on the walls, with lines and arrows and numbers that explain why water appears from the air. Daniel gave her chalk and started from the very beginning. What temperature is, what energy is, what pressure is. Aisha listened, took notes, asked questions. In the third lesson, she asked what enthalpy is. Daniel explained. The amount of energy a substance contains under given conditions. Aisha thought. Then she said that enthalpy is like the suffering of matter, the amount of what it has endured. Daniel grimaced. Then he thought some more, and admitted that the metaphor wasn't without merit. Hana watched from the corner. She didn't like that the teacher had a second student, especially one so beautiful, especially from the house that wants to destroy them. But she remained silent, because Aisha asked questions that hadn't occurred to Hana. Deeper, more abstract. Not how it works, but why it works. Yuna was watching too, silently, from the kitchen. She saw everything. She saw how Daniel came alive when Aisha arrived, how his voice changed, how he began to explain things at greater length and in more detail than usual. Yuna saw and remained silent, and she cooked dinner a little tastier than usual, a little longer than usual. Lena returned from her trip 2 weeks later and saw Aisha in the workshop. Lena didn't say anything to Daniel. She went to Yuna. They talked for an hour behind closed doors. Daniel didn't know what about. He was busy. He was designing the first aqueduct. A refrigerated pipe from Proklada to the nearest village 20 kilometers to the south. A copper pipe insulated with pumice. Water inside, heat outside. The pipe prevents the water from heating up and evaporating. 20 kilometers is a long way. A very long way. But if you break it down into sections, and if you set up intermediate cooling stations, each station is a wood-fired absorption loop. Any trained person can operate it. Daniel was drawing on the wall and muttering in English. Heat loss per running meter, the friction coefficient in a copper pipe, ammonia consumption per station. Hana was taking notes. Aisha stood nearby and was taking notes too. 2 students, 2 notebooks, the same formulas. Daniel didn't notice. Sonmi stood by the door and noticed everything. By the 6th month, 400 people lived in Proklada. Daniel didn't notice how it happened. He was in the workshop, drawing, calculating, soldering, going out to charge the batteries, coming back, drawing again. And all around him, the city grew. Yuna was building the city, not Daniel. Yuna. She assigned housing, appointed hall monitors, kept track of supplies, settled disputes, set the rules. No stealing water, no fighting. Children study. The sick get water first. Anyone who disagrees can leave. No one left. Yuna didn't ask Daniel for permission to make her rules. She simply implemented them. Daniel found out about them later, when someone complained or thanked her. He didn't object. Yuna did what he couldn't and didn't want to do. She managed. She built not pipes and circuits, but a society. A small, fragile, trembling society of people who had come from hell and still didn't believe it wasn't a dream. The capacitor bank had grown to 500 sheets. 4 absorption circuits ran around the clock. In total, Proklada produced 160 liters of water per day. Of those, 120 came from the condensers, 40 from groundwater. Plus, Lena brought in more barrels. 400 people received 2.5 liters each per day. Not a luxury, but life. Daniel knew it wasn't enough. He was working on a 5th circuit, a big one, 10 times more powerful than the previous ones. This required ammonia in industrial quantities. Distilling urine wasn't enough. Another source was needed. Tarek found it, a cave 3 hours from Proklada. Inside, deposits of guano, bats. Thousands of bats had lived in this cave for hundreds of years. Their droppings had accumulated into a 2-meter-thick layer. Guano contains nitrogen compounds. When heated with lime, it releases AM, the same principle as urine, but on a massive scale. Tons of raw material. For free. Daniel organized the extraction. 10 men collecting guano, 5 at the distillation plant. Rashid built a second distillation unit based on Daniel's blueprints, then a third. Ammonia flowed like a river. They're a flowing, caustic river of ammonia. But it was freedom, freedom from the effector's limitations. The Fifth Circuit came online in the 8th week. It was beautiful. Daniel stood before it and couldn't look away. Copper tubes ran in even rows. A generator the size of a barrel, a condenser with fins in which Daniel recognized the reflection of industrial plants from his previous job. The evaporator cooled a chamber with a volume of 30 cubic meters. The temperature inside was -2 degrees, in a world where it was 55 degrees outside. Yuna used the chamber as a central warehouse. Meat, milk, butter, medicine, herbs, everything that had perished from the heat now lived. Daniel began building an aqueduct. Not muttering or daydreaming, for real. The first section, 200 meters of copper pipe from the cooler down the gorge. The pipe insulated with pumice and clay. Chilled water inside, 50 degrees outside. Heat loss of 4 degrees per kilometer. After 200 meters, the water would warm up to 0.8 degrees. Negligible. Rashid and his apprentices pulled the pipe. Daniel supervised. Hana recorded the parameters. Temperature measurements every 10 meters. Every joint was checked for leaks. After 2 weeks, the first section was ready. Daniel opened the valve. Water flowed through the pipe. After 200 meters, it entered the receiving tank. Daniel measured the temperature. 12 degrees at the inlet, 12.7 at the outlet. A loss of 0.7 degrees per 200 meters. Better than expected. The pumice insulation worked better than he'd anticipated. He did the math. With these losses, the pipe could run for 5 kilometers without intermediate cooling. With cooling stations every 5 kilometers, 20, 30, further. He stood by the receiving tank and watched as the water flowed into the barrel. Clean, cool, silent. The pipe worked without him, without an effector, without magic, just physics, just copper and pumice and clay. Anyone could build such a pipe. All you need is a blueprint, and the blueprint was already in Hana's notebook, and in Aisha's notebook. Word of the aqueduct spread quickly. The neighboring village of Barnura, 20 kilometers away, sent a delegation. An elder, 2 assistants. They came on foot, a 2-day journey. The elder was an old man of about 70, skinny as a stick, his eyes watery from chronic dehydration. He walked into the main hall of Proclata and stood motionless for 3 minutes. Then he sat down on the floor. Then he began to cry. Quietly, silently. Tears streamed down his parched face, and he did not wipe them away. Because in a world where every drop counts, tears are a luxury. And here, at 18 degrees, he could afford it. He requested an aqueduct to Barnura. 20 kilometers of pipe, 5 intermediate stations, copper, pumice, working hands. Daniel said it would take 4 months, and people, lots of people. The elder said Barnura would send everyone who could work, 100 people. They would pull the pipe, dig trenches, install insulation. Daniel said they would have to learn. The elder said they would learn. They sat down and discussed the terms. Yuna led the negotiations. Daniel sat beside her and remained silent. Yuna spoke for both of them. Proclata supplies the copper and the blueprints. Barnura supplies the workers. Water flows through the aqueduct in both directions. Barnura pays 10% of the water received back to Proclata. Forever. The elder agreed without haggling. 10% of an endless supply of water is infinity. And 10% of nothing is nothing. The choice was obvious. When the delegation left, Daniel sat in the workshop and looked at the map he had drawn on the wall. Proclata in the center, Barnura to the south, the aqueduct line between them. And all around, dozens of settlements, tiny dots, people. Every dot is people who drink 2 sips a day and die slowly. He could reach every one of them. Theoretically. Copper and tubes and pumice and circuits. Theoretically. But he is alone. Hana is alone. Rashid is alone. Aisha is just learning. He needs a school. Not a workshop for 5 people. A school for 50, 100, where people will learn to solder copper and calculate heat loss and assemble absorption circuits and install insulation. An engineering school. In a world without electricity or books or universities. He turned to Hana. She was sitting in the corner, redrawing the diagram of the Fifth Circuit. Neatly, precisely. Every line in its place. He told her he wanted to open a school. Hana looked up. Then she smiled. Widely. Then she said she'd been waiting a long time for him to say that. Then she asked who would teach. He said, "You." Hana stopped smiling. She looked at him seriously. Then she said she was 19, and she herself had been studying for 4 months. Daniel said she knew enough to teach the basics: soldering, insulation, assembling a simple circuit, reading schematics. She didn't need to know everything. She needed to know more than the students, and the students didn't know anything yet. Hana was silent. Then she nodded. The next day, Yuna set aside a side cave for the school. Hana drew the first diagram on the wall: an absorption circuit, a simple one, made up of 5 elements. 12 students showed up: adult men and women, miners and former farmers and refugees. They sat on the floor and watched the 19-year-old girl standing by the wall with chalk in her hand. Hana was nervous. Daniel could tell by her hands. They were trembling. Then she began to speak, and stopped trembling. She explained clearly, simply, in short sentences, just as her mother had taught her, directly and without unnecessary details. An hour later, 12 adults knew what evaporation was and why a wet rag is cold. 2 hours later, they knew what pressure was. After 3 hours, they knew the principle of an absorption loop. Not the math, the principle. That was enough to start with. Daniel stood in the hallway and listened to Hana's voice. Yuna stood beside him. She was listening too. Then she said quietly that her daughter was like her father. He too knew how to explain things so that people understood. These were the first words Yuna had spoken about her husband without pain, with warmth. She turned and went into the kitchen. Daniel remained standing. In the evening, he went up to the platform at the cave entrance. The sun was setting behind the mountains. Orange light fell on the rocks. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees. Lena was standing nearby. She had returned from her flight that morning and hadn't had a chance to share the news yet. The news was bad. The 3 houses of the Wells, Al-Safar, Rin, Hamad. They had declared a trade blockade against Proklada. No one has the right to sell food or materials to Proklada. No one has the right to buy water from Proklada. Violators are denied access to the house's wells. A blockade. An economic stranglehold. The 3 houses were afraid. Daniel understood why. Coolness produced free water. Free water was killing the monopoly. A monopoly on water is power. Without a monopoly, the houses are just families with security guards. Lena spoke quickly. She was angry. She clenched her fists. She had lost 3 contracts in a week. The caravanners were afraid to trade with her because they knew what she was transporting to the chill. Daniel listened. Then he asked how much supply they had. Yuna answered from the darkness behind him. She had approached unnoticed. 2 months' worth of food, enough water, enough medicine. But food. Food grows in the fields below. Caravans bring the grain. Without caravans, starvation in 2 months, Daniel thought. Then he said there were 2 options. First, give in. Accept Al-Safar's terms. Hand over the technology, become a vassal, survive. Second, become self-sufficient. In 2 months. Grow food inside, in underground caves, by the light of campfires, with artificial cold that creates the right temperature. Underground garden beds. Yuna said it was madness. Daniel said that the entire last year of his life was madness. Lena laughed, short and bitter. Then she said she knew where to get seeds. She had a contact in the east, a farmer who grows grain in an underground niche. He doesn't answer to the houses. He's too far away and too small for them to pay attention. But he has seeds. Daniel nodded. Lena left the next morning. Daniel went down to the lower level of the cave. It was damp there, warm. Groundwater seeped through the walls. Perfect conditions for an underground garden. You need light, you need soil, you need ventilation. He found Tariq, told him they needed to expand the lower level. A room 10 by 10 meters, 3-meter ceiling, drainage channels in the floor, a hole in the ceiling for ventilation. Tariq asked why. Daniel said they would be growing food underground. Tariq looked at him. Then he said that Daniel was the strangest person he had ever met. Then he grabbed a pickaxe and went to chisel away at the wall. The underground garden beds were up and running in 6 weeks. Tariq had carved out a chamber 10 by 12 meters. Daniel ran 2 absorption loops through it. One cooled the air to 22 degrees. The second cooled the wall where the gutters with groundwater were located. Water flowed through the channels between the beds, watering the roots. Daniel assembled the soil from whatever was available: bat guano as fertilizer, sand and pumice chips as a base, and clay to retain moisture. He mixed it in proportions he calculated from memory from the soil science course he'd taken as a sophomore back on Earth. Oil lamps provided the light. 16 lamps along the walls. The light was faint, dim. Not the sun, but the plants don't need much. Lena brought the seeds 10 days ago. She drove the caravan faster than usual. She lost one dromedary on the way back. Overheating. The animal lay down and didn't get up. Lena didn't tell Daniel about it. Yuna told him. Daniel found Lena in the evening. She was sitting by the wall, mending the harness. Her hands moved automatically. Her eyes were empty. Daniel sat down beside her, silently. He sat there for 10 minutes. Then he said that the tanker he'd promised her would be ready in 2 weeks. A real one, on wheels, with triple insulation, with an internal ammonia cooling circuit. Lena didn't answer. Then she said that the drom she'd lost was nicknamed Red. He'd been with her for 4 years, survived 2 sandstorms, knew the route better than she did. Daniel was silent. Then he said he was sorry. Lena nodded. Then she stood up and left. 2 hours later, she returned and sat down next to him again, silently. She sat there until morning outside his workshop. She didn't go inside. She just sat there. The seeds sprouted 9 days later, green sprouts in the dim light of oil lamps. Yuna stood over the beds and watched. Then she knelt down and touched the sprout with her finger, gently, like a living creature, like a child. People gathered around, 20, 30. They looked at the green in the dungeon and were silent. One of the women began to cry, quietly, soundlessly. Green, living green that grows. For 7 years they had seen nothing green except lichen on the rocks, and here were sprouts, real sprouts in real soil. Daniel stood at the entrance and watched. Then he went into the workshop. He had a lot of work to do. The blockade wasn't letting up. The houses of the Wells were putting pressure on them, not with military force, with the economy. Caravanners were afraid to trade with Proclata. Prices for everything that couldn't be grown or smelted inside the mountain were rising. Cloth, leather, salt, tools. Daniel couldn't make everything out of copper and clay. He needed an answer. He found it a week later. Not him alone. Aisha. She came into the workshop in the morning and laid a sheet of goat skin before him, covered in her neat handwriting. Calculations. She had calculated the cost of water from the cooler's condensers. She factored in labor, copper, ammonia, fuel for the circuits, tube wear and tear, maintenance, everything. She came up with a figure. The cost of a single liter of water from the cooler was 12 times lower than the price of water from the house's wells. 12 times lower. Aisha said that if Coolness started selling water at half the market price, it would still be 6 times higher than the cost price. A 600% profit. And the houses would lose half their customers in a month. Because why pay for well water when condensate is cheaper and cleaner? Daniel looked at the calculations, then at Aisha. Then he said she had just written an economic weapon. Aisha said she was a merchant's daughter. Counting money was in her blood. Then she added quietly that her father would be furious. Daniel asked if she was ready for that. Aisha was silent for a moment. Then she said her father had sent her here as a commodity, like an item with a price tag. Here, for the first time, she was asked what she wanted. Here, for the first time, she learned that the world could be explained by numbers, not orders. She wouldn't go back, no matter what happens. Daniel nodded. Then he spoke to Yuna. Yuna listened to Aisha's calculations. She checked them. She found one mistake in the third column. She corrected it. The final figure remained almost unchanged. Yuna said the plan was good, but dangerous. If Proclad crashes the price of water, the houses will go from a blockade to war. Daniel said he knew. Yuna said they needed an army. Daniel said they didn't have an army. Yuna said they had something better. 400 people who have something to lose. A week later, Lena drove the first caravan with water for sale. 3 barrels, 600 liters, at half the market price. She reached the crossroads of trade routes 2 days from Proclata. She laid out the goods. They approached her an hour later. Not buyers. People from the House of Rin. 4 of them. Armed. They said trading water without a house license was forbidden. Lena said she didn't know of such a law. The eldest of the 4 put his hand on his sword. Lena didn't move. Sonmi stepped out from behind a barrel. 2 sabers. Her face was calm. Her eyes were dead. The 4 men from House Rin looked at her. One recognized her. A former bodyguard. A deserter. The one who killed the pursuer in the desert. They exchanged glances. The eldest took his hand off his sword. They left. Lena sold all the water in 4 hours. The profit was enormous, even at a reduced price. She returned 5 days later. She brought fabric and leather and salt and tools. The blockade cracked. It didn't break. It had cracked. Daniel stood at the cave entrance and watched as the caravan was unloaded. Yuna counted the goods. Hana hauled the sacks. Aisha took notes. Sonmi stood on a rock and gazed at the horizon. There, to the south, beyond the salt flats and plains, 3 old men sat in their opulent homes and counted their losses. And one of them, Zayd al-Safar, looked at the empty chair at the dining table where his 3rd daughter had once sat. In the 8th month, Daniel opened the hall, a large cave in the eastern wing of Proklada. The ceiling was 30 meters high. The limestone was white and smooth. Daniel had installed 3 absorption circuits and a condenser battery consisting of 200 sheets. The temperature was 18 degrees. Humidity was 60%. The air was just as he remembered the air in Seattle in the fall. Soft, clean, cool. The hall was intended for children. By that time, 53 children lived in the coolness. Most were born after the heat. They didn't know what coolness was, didn't know it was possible not to sweat, didn't know that air could be such that it didn't burn the throat. The first group was brought in that morning, 12 children aged 3 to 7. The mothers stood by the walls. The children went in. Carefully, as if into water. A boy of about 5 took 3 steps and sat down on the floor. His mother rushed to him. "What's wrong with you?" The boy sat there, running his hands over the stone floor. Then he looked at his mother. Then he said he wasn't in pain, that his skin didn't burn, that the air didn't sting his throat, that it used to be like this before him, before he was born. His mother pulled him close and covered his face with her hair. Daniel stood at the entrance and as if checking the readings on the monitor. The readings were fine. He wasn't reading them. He was looking at the boy and his mother and couldn't swallow because his throat had tightened. Yuna left the room. She walked past Daniel. He heard her breathing, ragged, short. She reached the turn in the hallway and stopped there. Daniel didn't follow her. He knew she didn't want to be seen. A minute later she returned. Her face was calm, her eyes were dry, her apron was straightened. She said lunch would be in an hour and that the children shouldn't be late, and she went into the kitchen. Sonmi stood by the wall in the living room. She watched the children, who had started running and laughing. A little girl came up to her and tugged at her hand. Sonmi flinched. The girl wasn't scared. She said the lady had beautiful knives. She could touch them. Sonmi looked her up and down. Then she slowly crouched down. Then she took one saber out of its sheath and placed it on the floor. The girl touched the blade with her finger, carefully. Then she said it was cold, like everything here. Sonmi didn't answer, but she didn't put the saber away. She just crouched there and watched the child who wasn't afraid of her. Daniel saw this from the hallway. He turned and left. That same day, he appointed Sonmi head of security for the children's hall. Sonmi didn't ask why, she just nodded. From that day on, she only took off her sabers when she was on duty. And when she entered the hall to see the children, she placed them by the threshold. A week later, the children were calling her by name. 2 weeks later, they ran to hug her when she appeared in the doorway. A month later, Sonmi smiled. For the first time in 2 years. It happened when a 5-year-old boy drew her on the wall with chalk. A little figure with 2 sticks in her hands, a big sun next to her, and an inscription in crooked letters. Aunt Sonmi is strong. Sonmi stood in front of the drawing, and her face did something Daniel had never seen before. Her lips twitched. Her eyes blinked. Then she smiled. Crookedly, clumsily, like someone who had forgotten how. At that moment, Daniel was soldering a connection on a new circuit. His hand trembled, and a drop of solder dripped past. Hana, standing nearby, asked what had happened. Daniel said nothing, just that the soldering iron had slipped. She looked at him, then at Sonmi in the doorway of the hall. Then she snorted and went back to work. That evening, news arrived. Lena had returned from her trip early. She had driven the caravan non-stop for 2 days. Her face was gray with dust and exhaustion. She said one word, Hamad. Karim Hamad, commander of the House of Hamad. He's gathered an army, 1,200 men, cavalry on dromedaries, infantry, archers, siege engines. He's marching on Proklada, a 2-week journey, maybe 3, depends on the speed. Lena found out from a middleman at the southern market. Hamad wasn't hiding it. On the contrary, he wanted everyone to know. A great army is coming. It's coming to take the source of cold. The man who makes water from air will belong to the House of Hamad, or he will die. Everyone has gathered in the main hall. 400 people. Yuna, Lena, Sonmi, Hana, Aisha, Tariq, Rashid. 12 students from the engineering school. Miners, farmers, mothers with children, old people. People who had come from hell and found a home here. and now they wanted to take that home away. Daniel stood before them. He was no orator. He was no commander. He was an engineer who wanted to go back to the workshop and solder tubes. But 400 people were looking at him and waiting. He said that Hamad was coming, that Hamad had 1,200 fighters, that coolness had no army, no walls, no weapons. There is a narrow entrance to the gorge. There is a mountain. There is a cave. There is cold. And there is something Hamad doesn't have, a home to return to. Daniel said he wouldn't fight. No one would fight. He wasn't asking them to die. He was asking them to work. 2 weeks, non-stop. He knew what to do. He turned to the wall, picked up a piece of chalk, and began to draw. For 2 weeks, Prochlada worked without sleep. Daniel drew a plan on the workshop wall and added details every day. The gorge leading to the cave entrance was 400 meters long and 10 to 30 meters wide, the only path to Prochlada. Hamad's army could only pass through here. Daniel wasn't going to stop them. He was going to let them in. Tari and the miners widened the gorge at its widest point. They cleared away the rocks. They leveled the ground. They made a path that was easy to walk on, an invitation. Rashid and his apprentices laid copper tubes along the walls of the gorge. They hid them under a layer of clay and dust. The tubes ran from 8 absorption circuits hidden in side niches above. The circuits were large, the most powerful of anything Prochlada had ever built. Each cooled a 50-meter-long section of the gorge. 8 sections, 400 meters, the entire gorge. Kana supervised the installation. She knew every circuit, every tube, every connection. 12 students from the school worked under her direction. They soldered, they insulated, checked for leaks. Aish kept track. Ammonia consumption, fuel reserves, how long the circuits would run at full power. 12 hours, enough. Yuna was preparing supplies. Food for 1,200 people. Not 400, 1,200. Daniel had given her that number, and she hadn't asked why. She understood immediately. She was preparing food for the army that was coming to destroy them. Meat stewed in the underground cellar. Bread made from underground grain. Water from the condensers. Cold. Clean. Lena brought the last shipment 3 days before the army arrived. Fabric for tents, ropes, and one more piece of news. Karim himself was coming with Hamad's army, in person. Lena had seen his banner, a black cloth with a golden sword. He was riding ahead on a white dromedary. Daniel nodded. That was good. He needed Hamad himself, not his generals, him personally. The army appeared at dawn on the 14th day. Daniel stood on a rock above the entrance to the gorge and watched. 1,200 men, dusty, tired, angry. 2 weeks of marching through the desert in 50-degree heat. The dromedaries could barely walk. The men could barely walk. They had been promised water and coolness and slaves and plunder. They had come to take it. At the front, on a white dromedary, sat a man in black armor. Karim Hamad, broad-shouldered, a black beard streaked with gray, a stern face, intelligent eyes. He stopped at the entrance to the gorge and looked up. He saw Daniel, a small figure on the cliff, unarmed, unarmored, in a work shirt with rolled-up sleeves. Hamad shouted up. He said he had come to take what belonged to the strongest, that Daniel had a choice, surrender or die. Daniel replied, his voice echoed through the gorge. He said that Hamad had a third option, to come in, unarmed, all of them, and see with their own eyes what they had come so far for. Hamad was silent. Then he laughed, loudly. Then he ordered the army to move forward, with weapons. Daniel didn't argue. He nodded to Hana, who was standing at the first perimeter. Hana turned the valve. The army entered the gorge, the front ranks, 100 men, 200, 300. They moved cautiously, expecting traps, arrows, rocks. There was nothing, only the narrow gorge and silence. Then they sensed it. The air had changed. It grew cooler, imperceptibly. 1 degree, 2, 3. The soldiers in the front ranks slowed down, not out of fear, out of a sense of it. They walked through the gorge, and with every step it grew cooler. 30 degrees, 25, 20. The circuits in the niches were running at full power. 8 circuits were releasing heat through radiators at the tops of the cliffs. The gorge was turning into a corridor of cold. The soldiers stopped, one after another. They took off their helmets. They pulled the wet rags from their heads. They exposed their faces to the air. 15 degrees. Someone from the back rows shouted that it was witchcraft. Someone from the front replied that he didn't care if it was witchcraft or not. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't hot. 12 degrees. The army stood in the gorge and didn't move. 1,200 men stood in the cool air and breathed, just breathed. Some sat down on the ground. Some leaned against the walls. One soldier lay on his back with his arms outstretched and closed his eyes. His comrade leaned over to check on him. The soldier said he wasn't dead, that he was just lying there, that the stone was cold, that he had forgotten what it felt like when the stone was cold. Hamad rode through the gorge on his dromedary. The dromedary slowed down too. The animal snorted and shook its head. It felt good. For the first time in 2 weeks of travel, Hamad rode to the end of the gorge. Daniel was standing at the cave entrance. Next to him was Yuna with a tray. On the tray were clay mugs filled with water, cold water. Daniel said one sentence. He said that anyone who wanted to could come in. Leave weapons by the wall. Inside there was food and water and coolness. No one would touch anyone. It wasn't a trap. It was an invitation. Hamad looked down at him from atop the dromedary for a long time. Then he dismounted. Then he took his sword from his belt and placed it against the wall. Then he took a mug from Yuna's tray. He drank. He closed his eyes. He opened them. Then he turned to the army and shouted. He said to place weapons against the wall. Everyone is to enter. That was an order. 1,200 men entered the coolness. Daniel stood at the entrance and counted. When the last soldier passed him, he closed his eyes and exhaled. Yuna stood beside him. She said there was enough food for 2 days. Daniel said 2 days would be enough. A day later, the talks began. Not negotiations, just talks. Hamad's soldiers sat in the main hall and ate. Stewed meat, bread, cold water. They ate in silence and greedily, not because they were hungry, because the food was delicious. Not just filling, delicious. Yuna had cooked for 2 days without stopping. Her food did what no ultimatum could. It reminded people that they were people, not soldiers, not machines of war, people who loved to eat good food in a cool place. Karim Hamad sat in a separate cave with Daniel. A low table stood between them. On the table was a jug of water and 2 mugs. Hamad was silent for an hour. For a whole hour, he sat and said nothing. He drank water. He looked at the walls, at the pipes, at the mugs of capacitors, at the frost glistening in the lamplight. Then he spoke. He said he had come to take Daniel as a resource, like a well, like a mine, a thing that belongs to whoever is stronger. Daniel nodded. Hamad said he was wrong. Not because Daniel is stronger. He isn't stronger. 400 men against 1,200. Daniel is weaker. But Daniel did something Hamad didn't expect. He didn't defend himself. He let them in. And now 1,200 people are sitting in the cool, eating hot food and drinking cold water. And not a single one of them wants to go back out into the heat. Not a single one, including Hamad himself. Daniel said that this is his weapon. Not the cold, not the water, but the fact that once a person has tasted a life of dignity, they don't want to go back to mere survival. Hamad nodded. Then he asked what Daniel wanted. Daniel said he wanted Hamad to get rid of the army. Not withdraw it, get rid of it. Disband it. The people who want to stay will stay. They'll work, build, lay aqueducts. Those who want to leave will leave freely. And Hamad himself, personally, he would get a job. Not status, not a title, a job. Hamad asked what kind. Daniel said he needed a man who would be responsible for the security of all the aqueducts and caravan routes from Proklada to Barnura and beyond. A man who knows how to organize people, how to command, how to defend. Not the city, the pipes, because the pipes are water, and water is life. Hamad sat and looked at Daniel. Then he said that in 40 years, no one had offered him a job. They'd offered him alliances and vassal oaths and gold and wives, but not a job. Daniel said that a job was more honorable. Hamad stood up. He held out his hand. They shook hands. Of the 1,200 soldiers, 170 left. The rest stayed. 1,030 people. In a single day, the population of Proklad grew from 400 to 1,400 residents. Yuna didn't panic. She had already calculated. She had already assigned roles. She assigned them. The former soldiers became builders, miners, porters, installers. Hana taught them 10 at a time each day. Basic skills, soldering, insulation, reading schematics. Aish kept track, ammonia consumption, copper consumption, water production. She set up a system of charts, new figures every day, a summary every week. Proclada's first accounting records. Sonmi formed patrols from the former soldiers, not for war, to guard the aqueduct. Hamad helped. He knew people, knew who to trust, who to put in charge, who to assign to the most dangerous section. A month later, the aqueduct to Barnura was completed. 20 kilometers, 4 intermediate stations. Each station consisted of a wood-fired absorption loop and a miner's hut nearby, 2 attendants at each. The water flowed from Proclada to Barnura without losing a single degree. The elder of Barnura stood by the receiving tank and watched the water flow from the pipe. Clear, cool, endless. He said nothing. He just stood there. Then he sat down. Then they took him away because he had been sitting there for an hour without moving. The news spread. Free water through pipes, from the mountain. No wells, no caravans, no houses. Settlements 50 kilometers away sent delegations, then those 100 kilometers away. Daniel received them all. Yuna led the negotiations. The terms were the same. Proclada provides copper, blueprints, and training. The settlement provides laborers. The aqueduct is shared, 10% to Proclada, forever. By the end of the first year, 7 aqueducts extended from Proclada in 7 directions. 7 settlements received water. 3,000 people drank condensed water. Daniel could no longer charge the batteries himself. His effector was used only for precision tasks. Everything else was done by the circuits, which were maintained by Hana's students, who were taught by Hana, who 4 months ago didn't know what pressure was. Daniel stood in the workshop and stared at the wall. A map hung there, drawn by Aisha, neatly, precisely, to scale. Proclada in the center, 7 lines in 7 directions, and empty spots all around. Dozens of settlements the lines hadn't reached yet. Daniel looked at the empty spots and knew that each one represented people. Living people who, right now, were drinking 2 sips a day and waiting. He couldn't save everyone. Yuna told him this every evening. He couldn't save everyone, but he could save the next one, and then another, and another. He picked up a piece of chalk and drew an 8th line on the map. In 2 days, Hamad would lead the construction crew east, and Daniel would go down, into the underground, to where, according to Tarek's rumors, the ruins of the old world city lie, to where there is metal and machinery and perhaps answers. Because after a year of work, he had realized one thing. He was building a city. But he didn't understand the world. He knew how to make cold, but he didn't know why the world had grown hot. And until he found out, he would keep building on the entrance to the old world. The old world was a 3-hour journey from coolness. Tarek found it by accident. A collapse following a nighttime earthquake had revealed a staircase carved into the stone, leading down into the darkness. The steps were even, polished. Thousands of feet had walked on them long ago, before the heat, before the world burned. Daniel was descending with Sarah Brinkley, 30 years old, an American from Portland, a cartographer and geologist, the second survivor. She had appeared in the coolness 2 months earlier. She had emerged from the northern caves where she had survived for 4 years in complete solitude. 4 years, without an effector, without magic, without people, relying only on her wits, stubbornness, and geological knowledge, which allowed her to find aquifers by the color of the rock and the direction of the cracks. She had mapped underground rivers throughout the northern massif. Her maps were more accurate than anything Daniel had ever seen in this world. When she first heard his English, she stopped in the middle of the main hall of the coolness. Daniel was explaining something to Rashid about thermal conductivity and cursing in English because he couldn't find a local word for the Fourier coefficient. Sarah stood there listening. Then she walked over. Then she said in English that the Fourier coefficient is the ratio of the rate of heat transfer to the rate of heat accumulation. And she cried. She stood there and cried for 3 minutes. Not out of grief, out of relief. For 4 years, she had thought she had gone mad, that this world was a hallucination of a dying brain, that she was lying in a hospital in Portland on an IV drip, delirious. And now a man in a work shirt was standing in front of her, ranting in English about thermal conductivity. So she wasn't crazy. So this was real. So she wasn't alone. Daniel gave her water, then tea made from local herbs. Then they sat in his workshop and talked all night. In English. For the first time in 4 years for her. For the first time in a year for him. Their native language. Words that didn't need translating. Terms that didn't need explaining through metaphors about the suffering of matter. Daniel told her everything. The effector, the coolness, the aqueducts, the contours. Hana, Yuna, Lena, Sonmi, Aisha, Hamad, 3,000 people, 7 aqueducts, the school. She told him, aquifers stretching hundreds of kilometers beneath the rock, the geological structure of the continent, volcanic activity in the north, indicating young tectonics and a mobile mantle. And something else. She had found traces of a human in the northern caves, not a local. Scraps of fabric that hadn't been woven on a loom, synthetic, polyester. She recognized it by touch. A plastic button, round, white, with 4 little holes, just like on any office shirt in any city on Earth, and a pencil stub with writing in Japanese. Someone had been here before them, someone from their world. Now they were descending the stairs into the underground of the old world, and the torch in Daniel's hand cast jagged shadows on the walls. Sarah walked beside him, silently. She carried her maps rolled up in a goatskin tube. 4 years of work, every cave, every fissure, every aquifer, everything on paper. The staircase descended 30 meters, then a corridor, wide, 3 meters wide, 2.5 meters high. The walls were faced with dressed stone, blocks fitted tightly together. No mortar, no cement, just a perfect fit. Engineering, ancient but real. Bas-reliefs on the walls. Daniel stopped at the first one. People, a city. 3-story buildings with balconies and rooftop gardens. Trees, tall, with broad canopies. A river, a wide, full-flowing river with boats, children swimming, women washing clothes on the bank. Clouds, real, fluffy clouds in a stone sky. The world before the scorching heat. Daniel walked along the bas-reliefs and felt something strange. A longing. A sharp, aching longing for a world he had never seen, but which resembled his own. Greenery, water, coolness. An ordinary world where ordinary people live ordinary lives and don't think about the fact that a liter of water can cost as much as a horse. Sarah walked beside him and said nothing. She was looking too, but her face was focused, not sad. She was searching. The corridor led to a hall, round, 20 meters in diameter. The ceiling was vaulted, high, 8 meters. There were niches along the walls where oil lamps had once stood. Now they were empty. Daniel placed the torch in one of them. Shadows danced across the walls. In the center of the hall was a stone pedestal, low, waist-high, wide, and a skeleton lay on the pedestal. Daniel approached, slowly. The bones were old, white, clean. 7 years in a dry dungeon without moisture or bacteria. Perfect preservation. The skeleton lay on its back, arms at its sides, legs stretched out. It had died lying down, didn't fall, laid down, neatly. Like a man who knew he was dying and decided to do it with dignity. A badge on his chest, plastic, on a lanyard. The lanyard had rotted away, but the plastic remained. Daniel bent down, read it. A name in Japanese and English. Kenji Tanaka. Company logo. Mitsui Cryogenics. Position. Lead engineer. Daniel stood over the skeleton and read the badge over and over. Mitsui Cryogenics. Cryogenic engineering. Industrial-scale refrigeration systems. He knew this company, not personally, but he had read their patents. They made cryogenic systems for liquefying natural gas. The scale was orders of magnitude greater than his data centers in Seattle. A different person, a different country, a different company, the same profession. A thermal engineer, cold, the same principle of transfer, the same world of arrival. Sarah stood nearby and said nothing. She had already seen something like this in the northern caves. Fragments, traces, but not a skeleton, not a badge, not a name, not a person. Daniel knelt down next to the skeleton. He placed his hand on the stone pedestal, and he felt it. An effector. Dead, cold, fused into the stone next to the body. A small node the size of a fist, exactly like the one between his shoulder blades. The same shape, the same density, but lifeless, cold, burned out, like a blown-out light bulb. Everything's in place, but there's no current. Daniel ran his fingers over the stone around the dead effector, and froze. Lines ran around the knot, carved into the stone, thin, precise, geometrically flawless. Daniel recognized them instantly, schematics, contours, not absorption, not compression, not evaporation, something else, something he had never seen before, larger in scale than anything he had ever designed. The lines radiated from the pedestal to the walls, up the walls, through the ceiling and beyond, through the rock, upward. Dozens of lines burrowing into the stone like the roots of a tree turned inside out. Not downward, upward, toward the surface, toward the atmosphere, toward the sun. Sarah took out her maps, spread them out on the floor next to the pedestal. 4 years of work, every fault, every crack, every tectonic seam in the rock across an area of thousands of square kilometers. She laid the map over the pattern in the stone. The lines matched, 1 to 1. The contours carved into the stone by Kenji Tanaka followed the very same geological faults that Sarah had mapped over 4 years of crawling through caves. He had used the faults as conduits, heat conduits. The scale was planetary. Daniel sat on the dungeon floor next to the skeleton of the Japanese engineer and looked at the diagram. Then he closed his eyes. Then he opened them. Then he stood up and walked around the room in a circle, slowly, counting the lines. 23 circuits, each leading into its own fault, each fault leading to the surface. 23 heat channels from the underground chamber to the sky. He understood. Kenji Tanaka, an engineer from Mitsui Cryogenics, had arrived on Sol first, 7 years ago. He received an effector, like Daniel. He studied it, measured it, understood the principle. An effector is a heat pump. It transfers heat from one point to another, from cold to hot, against the gradient. But Tanaka didn't set out to build refrigerators and condensers and aqueducts. Tanaka wanted to go home. He figured out that the effector wasn't a coincidence. It was a fragment of a system, a planetary system. Solaris had a mechanism that transported certain people from another world. Engineers, specialists in heat and cold. Why? Tanaka decided that the mechanism could be run in reverse, to create a circuit of sufficient scale, to direct energy through the rock to the surface, to break through the barrier between worlds, to return. He worked alone. For months, maybe a year, he carved diagrams into the stone. He calculated every circuit, every fault line, every line. His calculations were brilliant. Daniel could see it in the diagrams. Neat, precise, flawless. Tanaka knew his stuff. But he was wrong about one thing: the direction of the discharge. The circuit gathered energy from the entire planet. The heat of the mantle, the heat of the atmosphere, the heat of the rock, everything, and directed it upward, through 23 faults, to the surface, and higher, to the star. The circuit was supposed to break through the barrier between worlds. Instead, it disrupted the star's balance. The energy went into the sun flared up, the great heat, glaciers in 6 months, rivers in a year, oceans in 2, the world burned. Because one engineer wanted to go home, Tanaka died here, down below, in the basement of his own disaster, alone, in the darkness. His effector burned out from overload. He couldn't even cool himself with water. He lay down on the pedestal and died. Daniel stood over him and said nothing. Then he sat down beside him, on the stone, leaning his back against the pedestal, and sat there. Sarah sat down across from him. She took out a pencil and began to draw on the back of one of her maps, silently. Lines, arrows, numbers. Daniel watched. She was drawing the same outline, but with one change. The arrows weren't pointing up, down, not toward the sun, toward the planet's core. She looked up, looked at him, said the outline could be corrected. Tanaka's mistake was at the release point. He directed the energy upward, toward the star. But the faults run in both directions, up toward the surface, down toward the mantle. If directed downward, into the rock, into the mantle, into the planetary core, the heat that the sun has poured into the atmosphere over 7 years can be slowly drawn back. Not into the sun, into the depths. The star won't flare up. It will return to its normal spectrum. Over time, over years, maybe over decades. But the process will begin. The atmosphere will start to cool, degree by degree, year by year. Humidity will rise, clouds will return, rain, rivers, greenery, peace will return. Slowly, like recovery from a serious illness, but it will return. Daniel looked at her diagram. He checked the numbers in his head, the energy balance, the power of the flow through the faults, the heat capacity of the mantle. She was right. The mantle is an endless reservoir. It will absorb any amount of heat without a noticeable change. What killed the atmosphere would be a drop in the ocean for the mantle. The math added up. Then Daniel said that this would require a working effector, his effector. the only living effector on the planet. He would have to go down there, connect to the circuit, direct the energy through 23 faults downward, into the mantle. It would be like cooling not a room, not a cave, not a gorge, but an entire planet. His body would be the conductor. His back would be the radiator. Only a radiator isn't a flask of water. A radiator is the planet's core. If something goes wrong, if the circuit collapses, if the energy goes the wrong way, he'll die like Tanaka. The effector will burn out, and he'll stay here, on this pedestal, next to the skeleton. A second name tag next to the first. Only his name tag won't say Mitsui Cryogenics. His badge will say Park Climate Solutions, a small company from Seattle that designed refrigerators for server rooms. Sarah was silent. Then she said she knew. Then she said she'd help, that her maps were half the battle, that she'd be there, that if he died, she wouldn't abandon the cool. She'd take his blueprints and his students and his school and carry on. Daniel nodded. Then he said he wasn't going to die, that Tanaka didn't have an external radiator. He didn't have a team. He didn't have absorption circuits. He didn't have 1,400 people who could build anything from a blueprint. Tanaka worked alone. Daniel wasn't alone. He had never been alone since Yuna handed him a mug of water at the gates of Tel Karama. Daniel stood up. He dusted off his knees. He looked at Kenji Tanaka's skeleton. Then he bent down and removed the badge from his chest. Carefully. The lanyard crumbled. The plastic remained. Daniel put the badge in his pocket. Then he spoke aloud, in Japanese. He knew 3 words. Rest. I'll finish it. Sarah looked at him. She said nothing. They climbed the stairs in silence. 30 meters up, every step closer to the light, to the heat, to the world that needs fixing. The light hit their eyes after the underground darkness. White. Blinding. The heat wrapped around them like a wet, hot towel. 53 degrees. Daniel squinted. Then he opened his eyes. The mountains stood around them, motionless and patient. They had waited 7 years. They would wait some more. They returned to the coolness by evening. Daniel didn't tell anyone except Sarah, not yet. They kept the secret between the two of them. In a year or two, when coolness became strong enough, when the school graduated enough engineers so that every settlement on the continent had its own, when the aqueducts reached the last point on Aisha's map, when every absorption circuit is maintained by a student who has trained another student who will train the next, when the world stops depending on a single person with a cold node between their shoulder blades, then Daniel will come back down. Then he will lay his hands on the stone next to Kenji Tanaka's dead effector. Then he will direct 23 circuits downward instead of up, and he will begin to draw heat. Not from a jug, not from a barrel, not from a cave, from the atmosphere of an entire planet, through 23 fissures in the mantle, slowly, year after year, degree by degree. And maybe in 10 years, or 20, or 50, the Solaris sun will turn yellow again, and water will flow across the plains, and grass will break through the cracked clay. And the children who are now running through the Coolness Children's Hall will grow up and go out onto the surface and see the rain. But that is later. For now, Daniel was walking down the main corridor of the Coolness. The cool air brushed his face. 18 degrees, the air he had created. The walls his people had cooled. The pipes Hana had soldered. The blueprints Aisha had calculated. The corridors Tarek had carved out. The order Yuna had established. The caravans Lena leads. The doors Sonmi guards. The patrols Hamad leads. Not his city, their city. He walked into the kitchen. Yuna was standing at the stove, a large pot. Steam rose to the ceiling and settled on the cold copper fins of the condenser in droplets that trickled into a gutter and drained into a barrel of water. Yuna even turned kitchen steam into water. She had taught herself this, without blueprints, just by watching. Yuna looked up when he entered. She looked at his face. She frowned. She always saw. She always knew. She asked what was wrong. Daniel said nothing. Then he said he missed her cooking. Yuna snorted. Then she set a plate in front of him. Meat stewed with herbs and oil from the underground cellar. Warm bread from the underground oven, baked from underground grain. Vegetables that grew under the light of oil lamps in a chamber on the second underground level. Water from the condenser, cold, pure, 12 degrees. Daniel ate, slowly, savoring every bite. Yuna sat across from him. She didn't eat, she watched. Then she said quietly that he reminded her of her husband when he came home from hard work. Silent, tired, but not broken. Daniel looked up. She didn't look away. For the first time in a year, she spoke of her husband without pain in her voice. With warmth. With a memory that had ceased to be a wound and had become simply a memory. Daniel couldn't find the words. He nodded. Yuna stood up and returned to the stove. Lena peeked into the kitchen. She said the caravan was ready to leave in the morning. 3 barrels of water for Bar Nura, 20 copper sheets for the new station on the Eastern Aqueduct, and a letter from the elder of the Western settlement requesting an engineer. Lena saw the look on Daniel's face. She approached him. She squeezed his shoulder, tightly. Her hand was rough from the rains and the sun and the sand, but her grip was warm. She didn't ask anything, she just squeezed. Then she said she'd take any cargo wherever he told her, to the edge of the continent, or even further. Then she left. Sonmi stood at the kitchen entrance, as always, sabers at her belt, eyes calm, not dead like before. Calm. A child ran past her down the hallway. "See you tomorrow, Aunt Sonmi," he called out as he ran. Sonmi didn't turn around, but the corner of her mouth twitched, upward. Daniel caught her gaze. She nodded, once, briefly, as always. But that nod said it all. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I'll stand by this door for as long as it takes." Hana burst in with a notebook, hair tousled, chalk on her cheek, eyes burning. She said the school's 3rd graduating class had passed the exam, all 12 students, not a single failure. 3 can independently calculate and assemble an absorption loop without supervision. 2 can design an intermediate station for an aqueduct. 1 can teach. Hana said the last part with particular emphasis. 1 can teach. That means that the chain had grown longer. Daniel taught Hana. Hana taught the students. Now a student would teach the next ones. Knowledge no longer depended on Daniel, not even on Hana. It lived a life of its own, like a fire passed from torch to torch. Daniel said he was proud of her. Hana blushed. Then she said he was a bore and that she'd be late for dinner, and she ran off. But at the door, she turned around and smiled. Not defiantly, as usual, warmly, like a daughter. Yuna saw it from the stove, and Daniel noticed how she nodded slightly, silently, giving her blessing. Aisha came later, quietly, as always, with a notebook, goatskin, covered on both sides with small, neat handwriting. She sat down next to Daniel, silently, opened the notebook, and began to write. Daniel peeked over. She was writing a textbook. Chapter 14. Heat transfer in porous media. Formulas, diagrams, explanations in the local language. Every term translated. Every concept explained so that a person who had never seen a school could understand. The first physics textbook in the history of Solaris, written by the 24-year-old daughter of a water merchant who, 8 months ago, didn't know what temperature was, who came here as a commodity, as a spy, as a diplomatic bride, and stayed as a scientist. Daniel looked at her handwriting. Neat, clear, every formula in its place, every diagram accurate. He wanted to tell her something important, that she was incredible, that he had never met anyone like her, that in 6 months she had covered ground that on Earth would take 4 years of university, that her textbook would change the world no less than all its contours and aqueducts combined, that he stumbled in his thoughts, because next came a word he didn't know how to pronounce. Not in the local language, not in any language. Instead, he said that in Chapter 14, there was a mistake in the 3rd equation. The thermal conductivity coefficient of pumice is not 0.5, but 0.12. Aisha looked up. She looked at him. For a long time. Then at the equation. Then she corrected it. Then she said thank you. Then she said he could have just said he was glad to see her. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Said he was glad to see her. Aisha smiled. For the first time all day. Then she continued writing. Daniel was sitting in the Proclata kitchen. Surrounding him were people he loved. He didn't tell them that. He didn't know how to say such things. He knew how to calculate heat loss and solder copper tubes and design absorption loops and draw diagrams on the walls. But he knew they knew. Because every loop he built was built for one of them. A pitcher for Yuna so her meat wouldn't go to waste and she'd remember she could cook. A barrel for Lena so she could carry water and stop waking up from nightmares. A school for Sonmi so she could see living children every day and believe a little more each day that she had the right to live. A textbook for Aisha, so that, for the first time in her life, she would be asked what she wanted, and she would finally find the answer. Blueprints for Hana, so she could see her mother laugh again and understand that her home is a home. A job for Hamad, so he could learn that power isn't an army, but a pipe through which water flows. Each device was a word he couldn't say aloud, but one that could be heard. Every day, in every degree of coolness, in every drop of condensation, in every sigh of a person who came in from the heat and closed their eyes in relief. In the evening, Daniel climbed up to the platform at the cave entrance. The sun was setting behind the mountains, white, evil, wrong. The sun that a man from another world had broken because he wanted to go home. Daniel took Kenji Tanaka's badge out of his pocket. He twirled it between his fingers. The plastic was cracked at the edges, but the photo was still recognizable. A young face, glasses, a slight smile, an engineer, like him. A man who knew how cold worked, and who had burned the world trying to return to his own. Daniel put the badge away. He looked at the sunset. He wouldn't be going home. He'd realized that a long time ago. Not today. Not when he found the skeleton. Earlier. Maybe on the day the boy in the children's room said it didn't hurt for the first time. Maybe on the day Yuna started cooking delicious meals again. Maybe on the day Hana assembled her first circuit and her hands were shaking. He didn't know exactly when, but the decision had already been made. Not by his head, by something deeper. He would stay. He would fix the sun. Not to return. To give this world back to those who live in it. Because it is his world. Because these people are his people. Because this house is his home. Voices drifted from the cave behind him. Children's laughter echoed off the stone walls and sounded like music. The clang of metal from Rashid's workshop, rhythmic, steady, a hammer on copper. Hana's voice explaining something to her students, clear, confident, a teacher's voice. Lena's scolding of the herders, loud, cheerful, familiar. The soft clatter of Sonmi's sabers against the stone as she cleaned the blades at the entrance to the children's hall. The rustle of the pages of Aisha's notebook, barely audible, like a whisper. And Yuna's voice, calling everyone to dinner, loud, uncompromising, as always. Daniel turned and went inside, into the cool, into his home. He walked down the hallway and the cold air brushed against his face. 18 degrees, the perfect temperature, perfect air, the perfect place. He thought one thought in English, simple, quiet, like that first drop of water on the copper sheet in the Tel Karama basement. The sun is probably setting at home right now too.